Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we descend into the glow of a Victorian parlour where the fire crackles low and the velvet curtains trap in the air, heavy with perfume, dust, and just a hint of something bitter, something floral, something that clings to the back of your throat. You're not just a guest. You're standing in a room where a liquid ghost lives in a tiny bottle, corked tight, its amber shimmer catching the flicker of candlelight. Tonight, we explore the drug that turned Victorian women into ghosts. You probably won't survive this journey if you try to sip along, but that's the point, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and your local time. I always love knowing exactly where in the world you're drifting off with me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move across the thick carpet of the parlour, shoes sinking slightly into the threads. Everything here whispers of middle-class ambition, ornate wallpaper with dizzying floral repeats, upholstered furniture imported from France, a piano tucked in the corner, silent for now. On the mantel sits a row of porcelain figurines, pale as moonlight. But the real centrepiece of this gathering isn't on display like fine china. It's tucked into a side cabinet, a small glass vial filled with laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, dark as molasses, potent as thunder. You're told it's medicine. That's the word that makes everything respectable. A few drops in a glass of water for indigestion, a spoonful for the nagging cough that keeps you up at night. And for women, well, almost anything counts as an excuse. A headache, monthly cramps, anxiety from managing a household where the coal smokes thick and the servants gossip. Boredom so deep it feels like drowning in velvet. All of it can be eased with a dose. Doctors say so. Apothecaries say so. And besides, doesn't it feel so much nicer than enduring? The sound of teaspoons tapping china cups echoes around you. It isn't tea this time, though it could have been. Tea too once came from distant empires and changed the rhythm of life. But laudanum has no ceremony. It slips in quietly, a few drops, a swirl, and suddenly the edges of the day blur. It's easy to think of the Victorian world as one of prudishness, rigid morals, people fainting at ankles shown in public. But here in this parlour, you realise the story is more complicated. Respectability is everything, but addiction doesn't look like a vice when the medicine is poured by your own physician. And so, in these respectable homes, opium drifts like an unseen guest. The Victorians inherited their habit. Opium had already threaded its way through Europe for centuries. Arab traders, Renaissance apothecaries, Enlightenment thinkers praising its powers. By the 19th century, it was everywhere, in syrups, powders, tinctures. Laudanum was the star. Paracelsus had praised it long before Queen Victoria even dreamed of her empire. By the 1800s, bottles sold cheaply on every corner. It wasn't a secret sin, it was a household staple, and you imagine it sitting there beside the family Bible and the box of sewing supplies, waiting patiently for the next ache, the next restless night. Picture a dinner party in 1850. You're squeezed between ladies with lace collars and gentlemen with gold watch chains. Conversation swirls, railroads, novels, the weather in London, always the weather. And just as the candle wax drips low, a cough rattles someone's chest. Instead of fumbling awkwardly, a bottle emerges from a handbag and with a quick gesture the cough is softened. The party continues. It's almost funny. If you lived in that time, you might have carried your laudanum the way you carry chewing gum or lip balm. A comfort item, a little helper. It's hard to overstate how ordinary it was. In fact, some apothecaries sold laudanum candies for children. Yes, candy. The same world that buttoned its collars tight and covered piano legs with frilly fabric thought nothing of handing opium-laced sweets to a child with a fussy stomach. And here's your first reality check. Historians still argue whether Victorian society truly understood how addictive this stuff was. Some claim they couldn't possibly have missed it. The sweating, the trembling, the dependence. Others say people knew but shrugged it off, the way modern folk shrug about caffeine or alcohol. Either way, the bottles kept moving. The room grows hazy, not with smoke, not with dust, but with the subtle effect of imagination. What happens after a spoonful? For you, standing here, it's like watching the world slow to a heartbeat. The laughter softens, colours blur, edges melt. A lady across from you leans back in her chair, pale already, now ghostlier still. Her fingers relax from the embroidery she'd been fussing over. She looks serene, though you wonder what toll it takes inside. Fashion helps disguise it. Pale skin is prized. Thinness is elegance. A dreamy expression can be chalked up to poetic sensitivity. So when laudanum hollows out cheeks and drains appetite, it only feeds the beauty ideal. What is sickness in one light is glamour in another. The line blurs. You watch her smile faintly, eyes half-lidded, and you wonder how many women in this city drift like her, walking half in shadow, half in life. Step outside the parlour with me for a moment. The London streets are slick with rain. Horses clatter on cobblestones, gas lamps flicker. You pass a chemist's shop, bright with glass jars, red, green, amber liquids glowing like jewels. The sign says laudanum cheap, reliable, safe, and inside, no prescription needed, just coins exchanged, a small corked bottle slipped into your pocket. You could walk into 3 more shops along this block and repeat the purchase. Nobody asks questions. The drug empire runs both ways. Britain ships opium abroad, famously to China, sparking wars of trade and addiction, and yet consumes its own product hungrily at home. It's a loop of irony. Empire built on profits from a substance it cannot resist. Back in the parlour, a clock ticks slowly. You notice how everything here has a rhythm of waiting. Women waiting for husbands to return, waiting for children to grow, waiting for the endless rain to stop. Waiting becomes bearable when you soften the edges with laudanum. That's the real seduction. Not just pain relief, but time relief. It takes away the boredom, the weight of hours pressing down. Of course, not everyone approves. In sermons, ministers thunder against the moral weakness of indulgence. Pamphlets circulate warning of female intemperance. But here's the trick. When the doctor prescribes it, it isn't sin, it isn't weakness, it's medicine. And so the parlour remains filled with respectable women and their invisible vials. You lean closer to the mantel now. Among the porcelain figurines, one is a shepherdess with downcast eyes, cheeks pale, lips almost disappearing into her face. It strikes you as a little ironic. The figurine already looks half like the women around you, blurred, faded, delicate as if carved from air, ghostly, and you wonder, is this where it starts? Right here, in these parlours, with harmless spoons of syrup turning vibrant women into hollow statues. A thought lingers in your mind. Once upon a time, opium was a sacred gift in ancient civilizations. The Greeks linked it to Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, the god of death. Sleep and death, comfort and danger, always side by side. And here, in this Victorian parlour, you feel both gods in the room. The clock strikes 11. You feel the room dip into silence, each woman drifting into her own laudanum haze. One dozes in her chair, another hums softly to herself, a third stares at the fire as though watching another world unfold. Nobody says addiction, nobody says danger. They call it taking the edge off, finding rest, quieting the nerves. And you know, standing there, that this isn't an isolated moment. It's replicated in thousands of parlours across Britain, across Europe, across America. Bottles on mantles, bottles in handbags, bottles in bedside drawers, ghosts already forming. By the time you leave the parlour, stepping once more into the cool wet air, you're aware of a strange contradiction. Never before has a society been so obsessed with progress, industry, invention, and yet so willing to blur its senses with a drop of syrup. It's a world racing ahead while numbing itself at the same time, and the women at the heart of it? They carry the bottles, the beauty ideals, the burdens of silence. The story has only just begun. You leave the damp streets behind and step through another doorway into another parlour, though this one is smaller, more intimate, scented faintly of lavender and coal smoke. The wallpaper's a little faded, the furniture a little less grand, but the ritual is the same. A slim bottle sits half hidden in a wooden cabinet, ready to be uncorked at the slightest sigh of discomfort. You realise quickly that this isn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy elite. Laudanum is everywhere, and for women of nearly every class it becomes what polite society calls a little helper. You notice how the pattern repeats. A woman sits by the window, embroidery in hand, her shoulders tense. She complains of a headache, or of feeling low, or of the monthly cramps nobody discusses too loudly. A husband, tired from the factory or the office, might grumble at her irritability. But a physician? He arrives with professional calm and prescribes exactly what you expect. A tincture of opium measured in teaspoons. Doctors hand it out with the same confidence you might expect when they recommend rest or a walk in fresh air. No one raises an eyebrow. The deeper you look, the more astonishing it seems. A study published in the mid-19th century estimated that nearly 1 in every 10 prescriptions written in Britain involves some form of opium. Imagine that for a moment. Every 10th slip of paper handed to an apothecary sent a bottle of the drug into someone's home. And when you look more closely, you realise the prescriptions lean heavily toward women. The reasoning, though twisted, is simple. In a society where women are expected to be models of calm, grace and patience, any spark of restlessness is treated like illness. Do you feel weary from endless chores? Nervous before entertaining guests? Irritable from the weight of childbearing and house running? Well then, surely something is wrong with your nerves. And laudanum becomes the cure-all, the invisible bandage. It isn't entirely cynical. Doctors genuinely believe in its healing power. They've seen it stop diarrhea, ease pain after childbirth, even soothe tuberculosis fits. But they also know it dulls the spirit, quiets complaints, keeps the household calm. And in an age where women's voices are often dismissed as hysteria, laudanum becomes the neatest way to turn down the volume. You stand in the corner and listen. The doctor's instructions sound almost rehearsed. Take 10 drops in a little water, once or twice daily or as required. That last phrase, as required, is a dangerous key. It opens the door to self-dosing, to reaching for the bottle whenever the world feels heavy. Soon the instructions blur. Teaspoons become tablespoons, daily doses become nightly rituals. But for now, everyone smiles politely, reassured that a solution has been offered. In many cases, the bottle finds its way into the hands of new mothers. Imagine yourself in that role. You're exhausted from childbirth, body sore, spirit stretched thin by a crying infant. Friends and relatives tell you it's only natural to feel tired, but you don't dare complain too much. Then the doctor arrives, nods kindly, and leaves you with a tincture. A spoonful for your rest, he says. It works. The pain softens, your mind drifts, you feel the edges of exhaustion blur. It seems a blessing. But days pass, and without noticing, you're waiting for that moment when the syrup slides down your throat and makes the world manageable again. And in another room, across town, a different woman reaches for the same bottle, not for pain but for nerves. Perhaps her husband is strict, her life monotonous, her prospects limited. She isn't ill by any medical definition, but laudanum has been framed as a respectable indulgence. Just a few drops to lighten the mood, the way someone today might pour a glass of wine after work. You realise how easily the line between treatment and escape dissolves. There's something striking about the way women themselves talk about it, or rather, the way they don't. Diaries of the period sometimes mention drops for the nerves, or a cordial for sleep, always delicately phrased. Few call it by name. It's as though laudanum is both everywhere and nowhere, hidden in plain sight. Women joke lightly about their medicine, but the subject never grows into scandal, at least not yet. Here's a curious tidbit for you. Queen Victoria herself was rumoured to have used laudanum at times, particularly for menstrual pains. Historians still argue whether she leaned on it as heavily as gossip suggests, or whether her occasional use was exaggerated by critics. Either way, the idea that the monarch herself might sip the tincture makes its popularity all the more acceptable. If the Queen does it, how can it be improper for anyone else? You return to the parlour window, looking out at the soot-hazed city beyond. The industrial world roars outside. Trains, factories, smoke. Inside, the silence of laudanum reigns. That's the paradox you can't ignore. Men charge out into the world of commerce and empire, while women remain in enclosed spaces, their energy dulled by little helpers, and society praises them for being calm, subdued, graceful, as though drugged serenity is the ideal feminine trait. A single cough echoes from the baby's cradle nearby. The mother stirs, but instead of rising, she pours a few drops of syrup into a spoon and eases it into the child's mouth. Godfrey's cordial, she calls it. Opium again, this time disguised as a children's remedy. The infant quiets almost immediately, sinking into unnatural stillness. The mother exhales in relief. For her, it feels like control regained. For you, watching silently, it feels like the start of another ghost story. Doctors, of course, aren't entirely blind. Some mutter in journals about overindulgence or female dependency. Yet the tone is often patronising, blaming women for their weakness rather than questioning the wisdom of prescribing opium so freely. One medical writer in the 1860s warned of housewives who slip into indulgence under the guise of medicine, as though the problem were moral failing rather than medical malpractice. It's at this point you realise how deep the trap runs. Society creates conditions where women are overworked, underheard, and pressed into silence. Medicine then offers them a solution that ensures they stay quiet. And if they become dependent, well, it only confirms the stereotype of feminine fragility. You can't help but see the loop tightening, each turn binding women more tightly into a role they didn't choose. Still, the picture isn't uniformly bleak. In certain cases, laudanum genuinely saves lives. A woman suffering from dysentery in a cholera-stricken neighbourhood might find real relief. A mother in postpartum agony might recover more quickly thanks to pain relief. The drug isn't a demon by itself, it's the context that twists it into something darker. You're reminded of a saying from the time, "The dose makes the poison." That phrase, borrowed from Paracelsus, rings uncomfortably true here. Imagine, though, the cumulative effect. Year after year, dose after dose, laudanum seeps into the fabric of life. A dullness spreads. Bright, sharp voices dim into whispers. Energy wanes. Whole neighbourhoods begin to feel as though their women are drifting slightly out of reach, physically present, emotionally blurred. It isn't dramatic like a plague or a war. It's slow erosion, the quiet work of a drug disguised as medicine. You glance again at the doctor, now packing up his leather bag. He leaves behind the little vial, instructing the patient to use it sparingly. He knows, perhaps, that she won't. He also knows she'll thank him later, and that gratitude will keep his reputation polished. He closes the door behind him, tipping his hat. You hear the click of his shoes fading down the street. And inside the room, silence deepens, broken only by the clink of a spoon stirring drops into water. The parlour is dim now. A single lamp glows, haloing the woman's face as she leans back into her chair. You see her shoulders unclench, her breathing slow. She looks peaceful, almost angelic. And yet you feel the weight of what it means. This peace is borrowed, paid for by a debt she doesn't yet realise she's incurring. The phrase "lady's little helper" will echo in your head long after you leave this room, because you know what comes next. You've seen it beginning already. The pale cheeks, the restless hands, the reliance on silence in a bottle. You know where this story leads. But for now, the parlour seems calm, almost safe, as though nothing could possibly go wrong. You return once more to the parlour, but this time you're paying attention to something subtler than bottles tucked in drawers or teaspoons clinking in glasses. You notice faces. Pale, hollowed, almost luminous faces. In the soft light of a gas lamp, skin looks like parchment stretched thin across bone. Cheeks sink in where once they were full. Eyes glisten too brightly like pools catching firelight. And it dawns on you that the very sickness wrought by laudanum has been folded neatly into fashion. The drug doesn't just ease pain or hush nerves, it shapes how beauty itself is defined. You stand beside a mirror edged with gilt, watching a young woman examine her reflection. Her cheeks are pale, lips faint, her collarbones sharp enough to cast shadows. She doesn't look alarmed. On the contrary, she smiles faintly, as if her appearance confirms something she's been striving for all along. Thinness and pallor are the reigning ideals of mid-Victorian beauty. The heroine chic of another age, centuries before its name. Think about the portraits you've seen from this time. The faint flush of colour carefully painted onto cheeks, the dark circles beneath her eyes softened by an artist's brush. Women posed with languid expressions, heads tilted dreamily, almost as if caught mid-swoon. That look wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. To be pale meant to be refined, untouched by the dirt and sweat of manual labour. To be thin meant to be delicate, fragile, ethereal. And when laudanum drained appetites and leached colour from the skin, it only reinforced what society already demanded. It's a chilling loop. Women become sickly because of the drug, but the sickness itself is praised as beauty. A woman whose bones show too clearly might be whispered about as tragically lovely. A woman who drifts through rooms, eyes half closed, becomes mysterious, alluring. You realise with a shiver that the line between glamour and ghostliness was razor thin. Here's a fact for you. In the mid-19th century, cosmetics were frowned upon by respectable society. Too much rouge, too much powder, and you risked looking like an actress, or worse, a prostitute. But laudanum offered an alternative, an all-natural pallor, earned not from the paint box but from within. Women could point to their translucent complexions and swear no artifice touched their cheeks. The irony, of course, is that the artifice was chemical, not cosmetic. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some fashion manuals actually recommended avoiding the sun to preserve that pale glow, urging women to wear wide-brimmed hats, carry parasols, and even apply strange homemade concoctions, vinegar rinses, lead-based powders, to keep their skin ghostly white. Against this backdrop, laudanum's draining effects didn't look like illness. They looked like success. You could almost hear society applauding. Not everyone was convinced, though. Historians still argue whether men of the time genuinely admired this spectral beauty, or merely tolerated it as a trend. Some diaries suggest husbands complained their wives grew too weak, too unwell. Others record admiration for delicate loveliness that bordered on obsession. The truth likely lies in the middle. Ideals of fragility became fashionable, and women, pressured to embody them, found laudanum a convenient way to comply. Imagine it. You're expected to be ethereal, sensitive, fragile, yet also endlessly patient and cheerful. You're meant to look as though you're drifting through life untouched by hardship, even as hardship eats you from within. How better to achieve that contradiction than with a tincture that both dulls your pain and etches ghostliness onto your face? The parlour fills again with laughter, subdued and lilting. A group of women gathers near the fire, comparing embroidery and gossiping about who wore what at last week's ball. One of them looks particularly frail, her dress hanging loosely on her shoulders. Someone compliments her on her graceful figure. She laughs, though it's thin and breathless. You notice the tremor in her hand as she lifts her teacup, but no one comments. Instead, another woman chimes in, "Oh, she has the look of a pre-Raphaelite muse." Everyone nods approvingly. The pre-Raphaelite painters, after all, adored women who looked dreamlike, otherworldly, even unhealthy. Rossetti's languid muses, with their pale skin and heavy-lidded eyes, became the icons of beauty. How convenient that laudanum sculpted women into precisely that mould. The aesthetic was one of drifting in and out of this world, half alive, half phantom. You can't shake the thought, were they admiring beauty, or were they admiring sickness? The household mirrors become accomplices. Women check them constantly, adjusting bonnets, smoothing skirts, studying the fading colour in their cheeks. Instead of panicking, they sigh in satisfaction. A paler face means success, means belonging. Even the language around it conspires to soften reality. Nobody says wasting away. They say refined. Nobody says malnourished. They say delicate. Words are masks as much as parasols and powders. Step outside the parlour for a moment. On the streets of London you see the stark contrast. Working-class women, hauling baskets of coal or scrubbing laundry, are ruddy-cheeked, strong-armed, sweaty. Respectable society sees them as coarse, unfeminine. But middle and upper-class women, sipping laudanum in their parlours, look ghostly and frail, and society praises them. The cruel irony is that the latter group is destroying itself quietly, even as it earns applause for doing so. One evening, you pass through a bedroom where a young woman prepares for a dinner. Her maid laces her corset tightly, cinching her waist to impossibly narrow proportions. Already dizzy from the pressure, the woman takes a spoonful of laudanum to calm her nerves. She glances in the mirror, pale and trembling, and smiles faintly. "Perfect," she whispers. You almost want to protest, but the room is silent except for the rustle of silk and the faint clink of glass. It strikes you that beauty here is not about health or vitality. It's about performance. Performing fragility, performing faintness, performing a kind of spectral grace that reassures society of your refinement. And laudanum, with its hollowing effects, becomes the perfect stagehand. Let's pause for a curious aside. In 1856, an American writer described the opium complexion as a kind of ghastly radiance, a waxen paleness that seemed almost fashionable. He compared it to marble statues, beautiful in stillness but cold to the touch. You imagine Victorian women reading such descriptions and wondering if their own pallor measured up. What a strange, almost absurd thought, that the very signs of a drug gnawing at one's body could become the envy of peers. At the same time, caricaturists began poking fun. Satirical sketches showed women so faint and thin they looked like skeletons in gowns. The jokes were whispered, but the laughter was nervous. Everyone knew the truth lingered close beneath the surface. Back in the parlour you glance again at the women by the fire. They look like they belong in a painting, heads bowed, faces pale, hands folded in delicate poses. They could be muses, saints, or spectres. You wonder if they feel proud, if they even recognise the change laudanum has carved into them. Or do they simply see what the mirror reflects and sigh with contentment? The word ghostly keeps returning to your thoughts. These women are alive, yet their beauty is praised most when it resembles absence. Absence of colour, absence of appetite, absence of strength. They are asked to embody the very opposite of life, and laudanum helps them succeed. You step back from the fire, leaving the parlour behind. Out in the cool night air, you imagine countless mirrors reflecting countless pale faces across Britain. Each one a little dimmer than it should be, each one praised as lovelier for its dimness. The beauty standard itself has become a ghost, and you know the women following it will soon follow too. The ghostly beauty standard has been set, and once such a standard takes root, it's nearly impossible to uproot, until it consumes those who chase it. The gas lamps along the cobblestone streets sputter out one by one, and you find yourself drawn once more inside. The hour is late, and the house has shifted into a different rhythm. Quieter, slower, thick, with the kind of silence that only falls when servants have retreated, and the bustle of the day has burned itself down to ash. Here, in this hour, laudanum shows its other face. Not the polite dropper of afternoon tea, nor the faint ghost maker of beauty standards, but the companion of sleepless nights. You step softly, following the faint clink of glass, and you see her, a woman seated by the fire, shawl around her shoulders, a small amber bottle glinting at her elbow. The room smells faintly of soot and dried roses. Her embroidery lies unfinished in her lap, thread trailing uselessly across the cushion. Her hands shake as she measures drops into water. 10, maybe 12. Though who's counting anymore? The liquid swirls, catching firelight, then disappears as she swallows. The sigh that follows is long, weary, almost grateful. You realise you've arrived at the hour when laudanum becomes not just medicine but ritual. Sleeplessness is a cruel enemy in this age. With no electricity to stretch the day, evenings fall hard and heavy. The silence of night can be unbearable, punctuated by coughing from other rooms, the wail of a restless baby, or the gnawing grind of thoughts left unsaid during daylight. Doctors label it nervous insomnia, a polite phrase that hides a multitude of causes: grief, loneliness, domestic strain, boredom, anxiety. For every one of these, laudanum is offered as the solution. A spoonful before bed promises the elusive gift of rest, and at first, it works. She leans back into her chair, eyes softening, muscles unclenching. For a few precious hours, the sharp edges of her world dissolve. She will sleep, perhaps deeply, perhaps not, but at least she will drift. But you notice something subtle. Her bottle isn't small, it isn't nearly empty either. She has another tucked away in a drawer. Apothecaries sell it cheaply after all, and physicians prescribe without hesitation. If one bottle runs dry, another appears before the week ends. Slowly, without her noticing, the ritual expands. One spoonful becomes 2. Sleep comes faster that way. There's an irony here you can't shake. In trying to treat sleeplessness, laudanum often worsens it in the long run. Dependence builds. The body adjusts. Soon, without the drug, sleep feels impossible. Nights stretch cruel and endless unless softened by the tincture's touch. You watch her hands tremble as she sets the glass down, and you realise she may already be caught in that loop. Step quietly through the house with me. Upstairs, another bedroom glows faintly from a candle stub. A younger woman sits propped in bed, hair loose around her shoulders. On the table beside her is the same bottle, its cork stained dark. She takes her dose without hesitation, swallows, and lies back. But she does not sleep immediately. Instead, she gazes at the ceiling with a faint smile, as if waiting for a dream to come. You realise laudanum has another allure. Not just sleep, but escape. The hours after dosing blur pleasantly, turning anxieties into strange visions. Some women write in their journals of waking dreams, moments when reality softens and imagination blooms. One diarist described watching the wallpaper move like waves of the sea. Another spoke of conversations with long-dead relatives. These visions could be terrifying, but more often they were soothing, a kind of private entertainment in a world with little room for a woman's freedom. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously composed Kubla Khan under the influence of laudanum, his imagination unfurling in opium-drenched visions. Though his case was extreme, the association stuck. By the mid-Victorian era, the idea of the drug as a gateway to dreams spread beyond poets and writers into ordinary bedrooms and parlours. You too might sip and wait for something magical to drift across your mind before sleep claimed you. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some households even joked about their nightcap tincture, treating laudanum as casually as a glass of sherry before bed. Guests might share a laugh about whose dose was largest, whose dreams were strangest. The humour softened the edges of something far more serious, but it tells you how normalised the ritual had become. Still, unease stirs. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed these night doses were harmless, or whether whispers of dependency haunted them even then. Some medical journals warned of ladies wasting from excessive cordial. Others dismissed such warnings as exaggeration. In the parlour, though, truth is written in trembling hands, in bottles tucked behind prayer books, in eyes that glow too bright in candlelight. You notice how these women move through their evenings, sewing abandoned halfway, letters written but never finished, music sheets lying untouched at the piano. The drug's haze drains their energy even as it promises peace. They are here and yet not here. Present in body, absent in spirit. Ghosts in their own homes before the night is even half over. Outside, the city breathes differently at night. In poorer quarters, laudanum is sold in bulk, not in polished vials, but in crude doses handed across counters. A working mother, her child feverish and restless, buys a penny's worth to force sleep. A labourer spends his wage on a bottle, seeking relief from chronic pain. But in these parlours, among women of relative comfort, the ritual takes on a sheen of elegance. The same drug, the same effect, but cloaked in respectability. You pause by the window and look out. Gas lamps flicker. A carriage rattles past, wheels echoing like a heartbeat. Somewhere, a man sings drunkenly, his voice carrying through the fog, but in this house, everything is still. The only movement is the slow rise and fall of a woman's chest as she drifts into a chemically softened sleep. Think about what it means. Whole neighbourhoods lulled not by lullabies or prayers, but by spoonfuls of opium tincture. Behind countless curtains, behind countless doors, women surrender their nights to amber liquid. And when morning comes, they will rise groggy, pale, perhaps with aching heads, and reach again for the same bottle. You step softly away from the bedside, and the house seems to breathe around you. It's not the breath of healthy sleep, but the shallow rhythm of sedation. You sense the weight of it pressing against the walls, filling every room like an invisible fog. There's a clock ticking somewhere downstairs, its steady rhythm cutting through the silence. You let it guide you back to the parlour, where the fire has burned low to embers. On the table, the laudanum bottle gleams faintly, half empty now. The woman in the chair has drifted into uneasy slumber, head bent forward, shawl slipping from her shoulders. She looks peaceful, but there's a slackness to her face that unsettles you. It's the look of someone surrendering piece by piece, night after night. And you can't help but think, how many nights must blur before she's lost completely? How many doses before she no longer remembers what true rest feels like? The thought lingers as the fire dies, as the house sinks deeper into silence. You step back into the cold night air, pulling the door shut gently behind you. The street is nearly empty now, only a stray cat darting between shadows. You feel the weight of what you've seen pressing on your shoulders. This isn't just one house, one woman, one bottle. It's thousands. It's an entire society learning to blur its nights with tinctures, mistaking sedation for sleep, mistaking dreams for health. And as you walk, you imagine a chorus of ghostly figures leaning back in chairs across the city, eyes closed, bottles at their elbows. They look peaceful, but you know the truth. Each spoonful steals a little more of their strength, Each night blurs a little further into the next. The city sleeps, yes, but it sleeps in laudanum's arms. The morning light creeps through heavy curtains, and you find yourself stepping into another drawing room. This one orderly, bright, almost too clean, as though its owner is determined to keep chaos at bay. The smell of polish and ink lingers in the air. A tall man in a frock coat is here, arranging papers into neat stacks, his leather bag perched by the table. He is a physician, and to his patients he represents certainty, authority, and trust. Yet as you stand at the edge of the room, you sense a paradox pulsing beneath his polished surface. This man prescribes laudanum as though it were water, and he must know that it is not harmless. But denial sits more comfortably in his chair than honesty ever could. The 19th century physician walks a thin line. Medicine, after all, is not yet a science in the way you know it now. Germ theory is only beginning to take shape. Anesthesia is still new. Antibiotics are decades away. Against this backdrop, opium feels like a miracle. It quells pain, halts diarrhea, soothes coughs, lulls patients into sleep. What else in the doctor's bag can boast so many talents? Laudanum becomes his most reliable tool, a universal key to countless locked doors. The physician adjusts his spectacles and writes another prescription with a flourish. 10 drops in water, as required, he scribbles, words he has repeated so many times they flow without thought. He convinces himself this is medicine, not indulgence. After all, the patient is suffering. He is offering relief. Isn't that his duty? But you, standing here, notice what he chooses not to see. He doesn't stay long enough to watch the trembling hands measuring doses in the middle of the night. He doesn't see the bottles multiplying in cupboards, the teaspoons growing fuller. He doesn't hear the silence stretching through households as women fade into sedation. He leaves before the evidence accumulates, reassuring himself with professional detachment. One respected physician of the era wrote in a medical journal that laudanum was a gift of God's own pharmacy. Another praised it as the surest balm for the troubles of womankind. These declarations echo around you like hymns sung off key. Laudanum, they say, preserves household harmony, calms agitation, prevents hysterical outbursts. The unspoken truth? It also makes women easier to manage. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The official British pharmacopoeia of the mid-19th century listed laudanum as an essential medicine, with precise recipes for preparation. No doctor could deny its status. It was institutionalized, codified, legitimized. And so long as the state itself endorsed the drug, why should individual physicians question its ubiquity? But denial takes subtler forms too. Some doctors recognize dependency in their patients but shift the blame onto women's supposed weakness. They write in medical columns about female intemperance and domestic idleness as causes of overuse. In other words, if a woman becomes dependent, it is her moral failing, not the physician's prescribing habits. You sense the hypocrisy, the cruelty of shifting responsibility onto those who had little say in their own treatment. Step closer to the doctor now. He's folding his papers, humming under his breath. On the desk, among the notes, lies a letter from a patient's husband. My wife grows pale and drowsy. She can hardly keep house. I fear she indulges too freely in her drops. The doctor sets the letter aside with a sigh. He knows what the husband describes is common, but to admit it would be to question the very foundation of his practice. So he reaches for another prescription pad. This is where denial becomes willful. The physician could advise restraint, but restraint would mean leaving patients in pain, or worse, letting them believe he has nothing to offer. In an era when doctors compete fiercely for reputation, to appear powerless is unacceptable, so he doubles down. He prescribes more, not less, assuring himself that he is alleviating suffering. He convinces himself that a little more laudanum can't hurt. You picture the scene replicated thousands of times across Britain. Men in frock coats, bags in hand, handing out liquid oblivion as if sprinkling holy water. Each man believes he is doing good, or at least pretends to. Collectively, they form a chorus of denial, singing the praises of a drug that is quietly hollowing out half the population. Now, let me offer you a quirky tidbit. Some doctors even took laudanum themselves, swearing by its calming effects during long nights of study or travel. Imagine the irony, physicians treating their own exhaustion with the same drug they handed to patients, blinded by the comfort it gave them personally. They may have known its hooks, but like so many others, They convinced themselves they could manage, that their use was controlled, scientific, rational. Historians still argue whether most doctors of the time truly understood the dangers of dependency, or whether they were genuinely ignorant. Some suggest the medical establishment was naive, lacking long-term studies to prove what experience hinted at. Others insist they must have seen the signs clearly in their patients and chosen to look away. The debate remains unsettled, but standing here, you feel the weight of denial thick in the room. The doctor's bag snaps shut with a click. Inside, along with stethoscope and thermometer, lie dozens of small vials ready for dispensing, each one a neat solution in a world desperate for order, each one a step deeper into dependence for someone waiting at home. He rises, adjusts his cuffs, and prepares to leave for his next visit. Another woman waits across town, pale and weary, ready to be soothed by the same amber liquid. Before he steps out, though, he glances at the mirror above the mantel. His face looks tired, older than his years. Perhaps he feels the faint tug of conscience. Perhaps he wonders, just for a moment, if his treatments are cures or curses. But the thought passes quickly. There are more patients, more prescriptions, more rounds to make. Denial is the easier companion. You follow him out into the street. The city bustles around him, vendors shouting, horses stamping, smoke rising from chimneys. He strides forward with confidence, bag swinging at his side, unaware or unwilling to know the quiet devastation trailing behind him. Around him, the medical establishment continues its hymn, laudanum as medicine, laudanum as miracle. And the women who fade under its touch, they are dismissed as weak, as fanciful, as ungrateful. You pause, watching him disappear into the fog. The denial doesn't belong to one man alone. It belongs to an entire system built on reputation, authority, and the fear of admitting ignorance. Doctors, apothecaries, even patients themselves join in the illusion. This drug is a helper, not a destroyer. This drug is a balm, not a poison. But you know better. You've seen the pale faces, the trembling hands, the sleepless nights blurred into haze. You know the truth that denial keeps hidden, and you sense that sooner or later the weight of this denial will collapse, forcing recognition. For now, though, the city carries on, humming with industry and invention, while behind closed doors women slip deeper into laudanum's embrace, prescribed by the very men sworn to protect them. Doctors in denial, ghosts in the making. You leave the polished office of the physician behind, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the city's fog. The streets are alive with the sound of vendors hawking their goods, children darting between carriages, and the constant grind of wheels on cobblestones. But you don't stay outside long. Instead, you duck into a quieter house, a modest home this time, with plain furnishings, the faint smell of boiled cabbage, and a cradle pushed close to the hearth. The air is heavy, not with conversation or laughter, but with an eerie hush. You step closer and realise this silence is bought. The mother sits nearby, face drawn with exhaustion. She wears the marks of sleepless nights etched into the lines beneath her eyes. In her hand is a spoon, and beside her sits a squat brown bottle labelled in neat, comforting script, Godfrey's Cordial. It is marketed as a friend to mothers, a soothing syrup for infants, guaranteed to quiet crying and aid digestion. But you know the truth. Inside is laudanum, sweetened with treacle and spices. Opium in a cradle, disguised as kindness. She tips the bottle, pours a small measure into the spoon, and slips it between the baby's lips. The infant fusses for a moment, then sinks into stillness. The transformation is almost magical. The cries stop, the tiny fists unclench, the air becomes serene. The mother breathes a sigh of relief, shoulders sinking. For the first time in hours, perhaps in days, she has peace. It is heartbreaking and understandable all at once. In a world without reliable childcare, without maternity leave, without washing machines or ready meals, mothers bear an unrelenting burden. An infant's cries can shred nerves already frayed by labour, poverty and endless toil. And here, for a penny or two, is a miracle in a bottle. What mother wouldn't reach for it? Here's a mainstream historical fact. Infant soothing cordials were sold openly throughout Britain in the 19th century. Names like Mother's Friend, Quietness, and soothing syrup promised relief for both parent and child. Godfrey's cordial was among the most infamous, blending opium with sweeteners so even the youngest mouths accepted it. Apothecaries sold it cheerfully, sometimes even in grocery shops, no prescription required. By mid-century, reports estimated that thousands of infants were dosed daily across Britain's industrial towns. And here's a quirky tidbit. Advertisements for these cordials often appeared in the same newspapers that scolded mothers for failing in their duties. Imagine flipping a page to find one column warning that women grow lax in their care, while the next cheerfully proclaims that Godfrey's cordial ensures happy, quiet babes. The contradiction must have been dizzying. You look back to the cradle. The baby sleeps too deeply, chest rising and falling with unnatural rhythm. The silence in the room is heavy, almost oppressive. The mother resumes her sewing, the faint scrape of needle and thread the only sound. She doesn't notice the slackness in the infant's jaw or the shallow breath. She sees only respite. Historians still argue whether mothers of the time understood the risk. Some insist they knew. The deaths of infants from overlaying, smothering in bed, and convulsions often masked what was really opium overdose. Others argue many mothers truly believed the cordial harmless, sold as it was with respectable labels and trusted by doctors. Whatever the truth, infant mortality in industrial Britain remained staggeringly high, and opium-laced cordials were one of the hidden culprits. Step outside this house and wander the alleys of a mill town. You see rows of brick cottages, washings strung between windows, smoke pouring from chimneys. In many of these homes, both parents must work in factories to survive. Infants are left with older siblings, neighbours, or sometimes no one at all. A bottle of Godfrey's cordial becomes the babysitter. A few spoonfuls and the child will sleep for hours while the mother works at the looms or the father hauls coal. It is brutally pragmatic. The drug isn't a luxury here, it's survival. But survival comes at a cost. Babies fed too often on cordials grow weak, undernourished, their cries permanently muted. Some never wake at all. By the 1860s, medical officers began reporting shocking numbers of infant deaths linked to laudanum-laced syrups. Yet still the bottles sold, stacked neatly on apothecaries' shelves, marketed as salvation. Back in the quiet parlour, the mother hums faintly, her sewing rhythmic. She seems unaware of the long-term effects building in her child's tiny body. Slow development, fragile health, a nervous system dulled before it can even grow strong. She's only aware that the baby is quiet, and she's grateful for the silence. You can hardly blame her. The endless wailing, the sleepless nights, the sheer grind of care. It would break anyone, and the world offers her no other relief. But you feel the weight of it. This is how ghosts are made. Not just women fading from laudanum, but children too, hollowed before they can even speak. Generations touched by tinctures, whole households steeped in opium's haze. It isn't only the poor either. Wealthier mothers, too, use cordials when the cries grow unbearable. Nurses whisper it is the quickest way to calm an infant. Governesses slip it into bottles to ensure quiet afternoons. Respectable parlours echo with the same silence as slum cottages. The difference lies only in the packaging, the illusion of control. Imagine the contradictions for Victorian women, praised for their maternal devotion yet handed tools that undercut it, celebrated for nurturing their children yet quietly encouraged to sedate them. A baby crying was seen as weakness in the mother, a failure of discipline. And so, a spoonful of syrup saved not only sanity but reputation. Here's a small scene for you. A mother rocking her child in a cradle painted pale blue. The baby whimpers, the mother's brow furrows, and she pours a few drops from a bottle. Within minutes, the child is still. The mother leans back, eyes closed, and for a moment she looks peaceful, almost happy. You want to shake her, to tell her what she cannot see. But then you stop, because you know her exhaustion, her endless hours, the judgment pressing in from all sides. You understand why she reaches for the bottle. The silence, though, unnerves you. Babies are meant to cry. The absence of that sound feels like a house without a heartbeat. Step outside again, and the city seems full of these silent cradles. Behind lace curtains and soot-streaked windows alike, infants sleep too deeply, mothers sigh with relief, fathers rest after long shifts. Opium has not only entered the parlours of adults, it has seeped into the very beginnings of life. A generation is being raised with tincture on its tongue. The cradle rocks gently, but no sound comes. The mother finishes her sewing and folds it neatly, satisfied. She looks at her child with tenderness, with love. She doesn't see the danger in the bottle, only the mercy it brings. And you feel the contradiction twist inside you. A love expressed through poison, a kindness that creates silence too deep, too final. The ghost-making begins not only with women sipping laudanum at night, but with mothers soothing their children into unnatural stillness. This cycle deepens, generation after generation, and all the while the world carries on, deaf to the silence pressing out from behind every closed door. You return to the parlour, but this time you're not here for quiet bottles in nightstands or the hush of drugged infants in their cradles. Tonight the house is alive with chatter, perfume and candlelight. A party is underway, and you drift among the guests as though carried on the currents of satin and music. The piano ripples, the laughter rises, the men stand tall in waistcoats and cravats, while the women, well, the women are delicate blossoms, each one balancing on the edge of fragility. And suddenly you notice a pattern. Another glass of wine, another swirl of laudanum, another gasp, another fainting spell. It's the age of the fashionable collapse. A young woman rises to greet a gentleman, her corset laced tightly enough to squeeze her ribs into steel. She smiles, nods, and then her knees buckle. The crowd murmurs, but nobody screams. Instead, there is a rush of admiration. Someone fans her gently, another offers a glass of water, and she's carried to a chaise longue where she lies with eyes half closed, pale and ethereal. You realise the faint isn't scandal, it's spectacle. In fact, it's practically expected. The corset takes much of the blame, of course. Doctors warn that squeezing the body so tightly restricts breath, crushes organs and encourages fainting. But you know better. Sometimes the corset is only half the story. The other half sits quietly in the women's handbags, in tiny vials tucked discreetly beside lace handkerchiefs. A spoonful of laudanum before the party keeps nerves steady, eases headaches, loosens shyness. But by the time conversation quickens and the air thickens with candle smoke, the drug's haze combines with the corset's grip and the warm press of bodies. Collapse is inevitable. Fainting, though, is never just about physiology. It's performance. To faint delicately is to display refinement, sensitivity, a nervous system tuned so finely it cannot bear the roughness of the world. In a society that prizes fragility in women, a faint is almost a badge of honour. You imagine a sly thought slipping through the room each time a woman collapses. Ah, she is truly delicate, truly feminine. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Etiquette manuals of the Victorian era often included instructions for how a hostess or guest might respond to fainting. It was so common that it had its own rituals, rooms equipped with fainting couches, maids trained to fetch water and salts, hosts expected to continue conversation smoothly as though nothing had happened. And here's a quirky tidbit. Smelling salts, those sharp little vials meant to revive fainted women, often contained ammonia, but sometimes were themselves laced with just a touch of stimulants, creating a strange cycle of dosing and counter-dosing. A woman might take laudanum to soften her mood, faint from the combined effects, then be revived by a jolt of salts only to sip more laudanum later to calm her fluttering nerves. Victorian pharmacology was a dance of contradictions. Historians still argue whether fainting was truly as common as novels and diaries suggest, or whether it became exaggerated in cultural memory. Some insist the faint was a theatrical gesture, performed more often for effect than from genuine weakness. Others argue the combination of corsetry, poor air circulation and laudanum made collapse inevitable. Perhaps, as with so many Victorian things, it was both. Part reality, part performance, part expectation. You hover at the edge of the party and watch as another woman sways, her glass tipping, her cheeks ghostly pale. She lowers herself just in time onto a chair, a half faint, and everyone clucks sympathetically. You realise no one whispers about addiction or weakness. They praise her delicacy, her sensitivity, even her beauty in the moment of near collapse. What you see as ghostliness, they see as grace. Step into the powder room with me. It's quieter here, the chatter muffled by thick doors. A group of women sit resting on fainting couches, their corsets loosened slightly, small bottles tucked into reticules. They speak softly, comparing remedies. A few drops before supper, one confesses. It makes me brave enough to converse. Another nods knowingly. Oh yes, I cannot bear the crowd otherwise. They laugh lightly, even as their hands tremble. One woman admits she sometimes faints on purpose. "It draws such gallant attention," she says, eyes sparkling. One must be careful not to overdo it, of course. You see how the performance of fragility becomes social currency. The drug feeds the faint feeds admiration, and admiration feeds dependence. The cycle is complete. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, music swells. Couples glide in figures across the floor, skirts swishing, boots tapping. But the rhythm is punctuated by sudden absences, one woman stepping aside, another collapsing into a chair. It is almost part of the choreography, woven into the evening as naturally as the waltz itself. And as you watch, you wonder, how many of these fainting women are simply overwhelmed by corsets and candle heat, and how many are drifting from laudanum's haze? The truth is likely blurred, like everything touched by the drug. There's something deeply unsettling about the normalization of it all. In an age obsessed with respectability, fainting becomes respectable. In an age terrified of scandal, laudanum becomes invisible. Women collapse in drawing rooms and ballrooms, and nobody connects the dots. They are praised for their fragility, admired for their ghostly pallor, even desired for their faintness. You linger by the musicians, who exchange tired glances. They've seen it all before. Another dance, another faint, another interruption. To them it's background noise, the rhythm of Victorian society itself. And yet, you feel the weight of it pressing in. This isn't just an occasional swoon, it's the steady erosion of vitality disguised as grace. As the party winds down, guests depart into the foggy night. The fainting couches are empty again, but the bottles are lighter, the hands more tremulous. Women climb into carriages, pale faces turn to the gaslit streets. You realise each of them will carry the memory of their faint proudly, as if it were proof of refinement. And yet you know it is another step toward ghostliness, another layer of silence laid over their lives. The fashionable faint is both symptom and symbol, a society celebrating fragility while quietly destroying the very women it places on pedestals. And as you watch the last carriage roll away, wheels echoing into the night, you can't shake the feeling that the faint isn't just a momentary collapse. It is the metaphor of an entire generation, a culture swooning under the weight of its own illusions. You step out of the fog-damp street and into a different kind of parlour, this one thick with the smell of ink, candle wax and tobacco. Stacks of papers spill across a desk, blotches of ink marking where thoughts have outrun the hand that tried to catch them. The air here is restless, charged, almost feverish. A man sits hunched over, eyes wild and tired, pen scratching furiously, and beside him rests the familiar amber bottle. This is no ordinary parlour, it's a study, and you've wandered into the lair of the Victorian imagination. Here, laudanum isn't just medicine or mother's helper. Here, it is the muse. The writer dips his pen again, pauses, takes a sip from a glass laced with the tincture, and then continues with renewed fervour. His words spill onto the page as though conjured from somewhere beyond him, images and rhythms blooming too quickly for reason to keep pace. And you realise you've stumbled upon one of the strangest legacies of this drug, how it stitched itself into literature, into poetry, into the very dreamscape of Victorian creativity. Opium had been linked to inspiration long before the Victorians, but in this age laudanum became its most accessible form. Writers and poets praised it, cursed it, feared it, depended on it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, though not Victorian but romantic, looms as a ghost in this room. His Kubla Khan, famously conceived during an opium dream, set the precedent. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater turned personal indulgence into public fascination, painting laudanum as both angel and demon, and Victorian readers devoured these tales, half horrified, half enchanted. Mainstream historical fact: De Quincey's Confessions, first published in 1821, sold widely, and influenced generations of readers. It described laudanum's capacity for both soaring visions and terrifying nightmares, making the drug both infamous and oddly alluring. It was, in some sense, the first drug memoir to captivate the public, and it left its fingerprints on the way Victorians thought about laudanum, not just as medicine, but as gateway to strange inner worlds. You look around the study and see those fingerprints everywhere. On the desk lies a half-finished manuscript, its sentences winding and looping as if guided by a mind half in dream. On the wall hangs a print of Dante, another of Milton, writers who walked through hells and heavens of the imagination. The man at the desk believes himself heir to that tradition. He believes his bottle is his lantern, illuminating realms he could not otherwise enter. And yet you see the toll. His eyes are red-rimmed, his hand shakes, his posture sagging under invisible weight. The visions come, yes, but so does the hollowing, the wasting, the endless need for another sip, another night blurred into unreality. You can't help but wonder, is he writing from inspiration or from captivity? Step outside this study and you'll find others like it. In smoky lodgings across London, aspiring poets chase the same dragon. They sip laudanum in cheap glasses, waiting for visions. They scribble furiously by candlelight, convinced that genius requires intoxication. And perhaps some of them do glimpse brilliance, fragments of poetry, wild metaphors, images dripping with strange beauty. But most fade into obscurity, their manuscripts unfinished, their health destroyed. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some literary clubs of the time actually joked about opium nights, gatherings where members dosed themselves lightly and read their strange compositions aloud. Few of these works survived, but the idea of intoxicated creativity became part of literary myth. The bottle wasn't just medicine, it was a badge of rebellion, of artistic seriousness. But historians still argue whether laudanum truly fueled genius or simply destroyed it. Some insist Coleridge and De Quincey owed their most famous works to opium's visions. Others argue just as passionately that the drug robbed them of greater achievements, cutting their productivity short, leaving fragments where masterpieces might have been. The debate remains unresolved. Was the muse laudanum gave worth the price it extracted? Standing here in the dim study, watching ink-stained fingers tremble, you sense the answer leans heavily toward no. Still, the romance of it lingers. Readers in the 19th century devoured tales of laudanum dreams. Newspapers printed essays speculating on its effects. Critics debated whether drug-born visions had artistic legitimacy. The public imagination was captivated. Ghostliness, it seemed, was not just confined to women fading in parlours. It became a kind of cultural fascination too, embodied in writers chasing visions through fog and ink. You glance again at the manuscript on the desk. The words blur, but you catch glimpses. Rivers of fire, cities of glass, voices from the dead. They are strange, haunting images, perhaps beautiful, perhaps grotesque. The writer mutters to himself, pen scratching faster, until suddenly he stops, staring into space with glassy eyes. His hand reaches automatically for the bottle. There's a deeper irony here. While doctors prescribe laudanum to women to quiet their nerves and keep them subdued, men, particularly artists, use the same drug to elevate themselves, to claim inspiration, even brilliance. The same substance that silences one half of society is celebrated as a muse for the other. You can't miss the hypocrisy. Women's ghostliness is treated as weakness. Men's is framed as genius. The contrast stings as you watch him drain another glass. He is praised for his daring experiments with imagination, while women who fade into similar hazes are whispered about as delicate invalids. Two genders, one drug, two entirely different stories told about its effects. The clock ticks past midnight. The candle burns low, dripping wax onto the desk. The writer slumps forward, exhausted, his pages scattered around him. You gather them with your eyes, fragments of brilliance tangled with incoherence. It is the perfect metaphor for laudanum's gift and curse. It offers flashes of light, then plunges everything into shadow. The room smells of ink and opium, sharp and sweet. You feel the weight of centuries of literature woven with this scent, this haze. From Coleridge to lesser-known poets, from De Quincey's public confessions to the private journals of nameless writers, laudanum's ghost drifts through Victorian prose like an unseen watermark. You step quietly out of the study, leaving the man asleep on his desk, his bottle nearly empty. Outside, the city sleeps too, or at least tries to. Somewhere, women lie pale in their beds, dosing themselves into quiet. Somewhere else, mothers hush their infants with syrup. And here, in these cramped rooms, writers chase visions that leave them hollow. The ghost-making takes many forms. Tonight you've seen how it shapes literature, how it masquerades as inspiration. But you can't forget the tremor in the writer's hand, the slackness of his jaw as he dozed. Ghostliness isn't brilliance, it's erasure dressed in beauty's clothes, and so you walk on through the fog, knowing that tomorrow the world will read his words with awe, never guessing how much of him was already gone. The parlour is quiet again, though this time not with the dreamy hush of laudanum-drowsed women or infants lulled by cordial. Tonight, the silence carries a different weight, the tense kind that falls before voices dare to speak. You've stepped into a room where the lamps are trimmed low, where the curtains are drawn not against the night but against the neighbours. A handful of men and women sit in a circle, newspapers folded on their laps, hands fidgeting. The amber bottles are still here, of course they are, but the conversation has shifted. For the first time you hear doubt. A gentleman clears his throat, unfolding the Times and pointing to a column. The headline, small but pointed, mutters about female intemperance. Another paper on the table speaks of household reliance upon the opium tincture. The words are cautious, almost apologetic, but they are there. People are beginning to whisper that something is wrong. Laudanum's reign has lasted decades by now. It has slipped easily into every corner of society, parlours, nurseries, studies, sick rooms, and yet, slowly, the cracks show. Reports of women wasting away, of children dead in cradles, of men ruined by visions too strange to shake. These stories seep into print, but always in hushed tones, never shouted. To confront laudanum openly would mean confronting the medical establishment, the apothecaries, even the Crown itself. Far easier to whisper than to shout. You lean closer to hear. A matron murmurs that her cousin has grown dependent upon the cordial, her once bright wit now dulled. A gentleman responds that he has read similar accounts from Manchester. Whole working-class neighbourhoods filled with mothers dosing their babies, while they toil in factories. Another woman insists the papers exaggerate. Surely doctors would not allow such harm. The circle nods uneasily, the debate swelling then shrinking again. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1860s, official reports were beginning to acknowledge the widespread use of opium in Britain, especially in industrial towns. The Registrar General's office noted high rates of infant mortality tied to opiate cordials. Parliamentary inquiries collected testimonies from doctors and clergy about the miserable habit spreading among women. It was no longer possible to deny outright. But public discourse remained cautious, reluctant, and here's a quirky tidbit. One satirical magazine printed a cartoon of a pale woman clutching a bottle labelled "Drops for Every Ill," while her husband, stout and oblivious, praised her perfect serenity. The caption read, "The secret of a happy home." People laughed nervously. The joke landed because it was true. Historians still argue how much ordinary Victorians truly knew. Did households recognise addiction in their midst, or did they sincerely believe laudanum was harmless if taken properly? Some scholars suggest denial was so thick that families simply refused to name what they saw. Others insist that whispered jokes and worried letters prove a deeper awareness simmered beneath the surface. The answer remains blurred, like the laudanum haze itself. You glance around the circle again. The newspapers shuffle, tea grows cold, no one quite daring to say what they really fear. That an entire generation of women is dissolving into ghostliness, and that society itself is complicit. Instead, they cling to safer explanations. One gentleman blames corsets, another blames poor diet, someone else blames weak female constitutions, anything but the bottle on the table. The women themselves sit quietly, eyes lowered. You wonder what they think, whether they know the truth in their bones. One young wife presses a handkerchief to her lips, her fingers trembling faintly. You recognise the sign immediately, the tremor of someone dosing nightly. She does not speak. Perhaps she cannot. Step outside with me. In the smoky corner of a public house, men debate the same thing, though more coarsely. They're all addicted, the lot of them, one sneers. Another shrugs. Better they're quiet than quarrelsome. The laughter that follows is rough, but beneath it lies the same unease. Everyone knows laudanum is everywhere, yet no one quite knows what to do about it. Meanwhile, pamphlets circulate, warning of poison in the nursery or ladies wasting in secret. Reformers begin to mutter about regulation, but their voices are small, drowned out by the endless demand for comfort, for silence, for escape. Back in the parlour, the debate continues in circles. Someone recalls a sermon railing against false comfort. Another insists their physician prescribes it daily, so it must be safe. The room feels like it is spinning, trapped between acknowledgement and denial. No one wants to admit responsibility. No one wants to surrender the bottle that has become indispensable. It strikes you that these hushed debates are as ghostly as the women themselves, half-spoken, half-denied, drifting between recognition and silence. Even when the evidence piles high, sickly mothers, dead infants, wasted poets, the conversation remains timid. No one shouts, no one slams a fist. The whispers fade into the wallpaper like smoke, and yet you sense the beginning of change. Every whisper adds weight. Every newspaper column, however cautious, plants a seed. The debates in hushed tones may not stop the bottles from being poured tonight, but they build a tension that will eventually break. For now, though, it is still twilight. Society hovering between enchantment and fear, unable to decide whether laudanum is blessing or curse. The lamp sputters, the newspapers fold, the guests disperse into the night, carrying their unease with them. The bottles remain on the tables waiting patiently for the next dose, and you walk out into the fog, hearing in the silence the echoes of debates too soft to matter, yet not soft enough to disappear entirely. The fog hangs heavy tonight, clinging to your coat as you step into the bustling high street. Carriages rattle past, shop signs creak on iron hinges, and the smell of damp wool and horse manure mingles with something sharper. Spices, oils, chemicals. You pause before a bright window, its shelves stacked with glass jars in every imaginable colour. Red, green, amber, cobalt. They gleam like jewels in the lamplight. The sign above the door reads, "Apothecary," and inside lies the beating heart of Britain's opium habit. You push open the door. A bell tinkles overhead. Immediately the air shifts, thick with the scent of camphor, peppermint, dried herbs, and beneath it all, the faint floral bitterness of opium tinctures. The counter is crowded. Powders in paper packets, syrups in squat bottles, lozenges wrapped in waxed paper. Behind it, rows of drawers labelled with Latin names, Papaver somniferum, poppy of sleep among them. The apothecary himself, waistcoat stretched over his belly, bustles about cheerfully, filling orders, weighing powders on brass scales, corking bottles with efficient taps of his mallet. It hits you almost immediately. Laudanum isn't hidden in shadows here. It isn't whispered about as scandalous. It sits openly on shelves, priced cheaply enough that nearly anyone can afford it. The apothecary sells it to ladies in fine bonnets, to factory men coughing up coal dust, to weary mothers tugging toddlers by the hand. The line stretches out the door some days. No prescription required, no questions asked. You need only coins in your palm. Mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, opium was sold freely across Britain in thousands of apothecaries, grocers, and even general shops. Laudanum in particular was astonishingly cheap, often just a few pence for a small bottle, making it more affordable than alcohol and in some cases safer to store than gin or whiskey. It became a staple of both respectable parlours and working-class tenements. A young boy approaches the counter, clutching a note from his mother. The apothecary reads it, nods, and hands over a vial labelled "Tincture of Opium, 10 drops as needed." The boy tucks it into his coat pocket as casually as if it was sugar or tea. You realise how deeply normalised it has become. The corner pharmacy functions not only as a place of healing, but as a quiet engine of ghost-making, dispensing bottles that hollow bodies and silence cries. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, apothecaries actually marketed laudanum in candy lozenges, opium wrapped in sweetness, meant for children with sore throats. Imagine sucking on what seemed like a harmless sweet, never knowing it carried the same ghostly seeds that dulled your mother's nerves at night. You wander further inside. The shelves seem endless. Cordials, cough syrups, sleep draughts, digestive tonics. Nearly all contain opium in some measure. The labels are ornate, promising comfort, relief, even vitality. They read like poetry, Mother Bailey's quiet mixture, Dalby's carminative, Batley's sedative solution. The names disguise the truth. Each is another mask for the same amber ghost. Historians still argue whether most apothecaries truly understood the scale of dependency they fueled. Some claim these men were innocent shopkeepers, following demand. Others argue they knew perfectly well and chose profit over principle. Either way, the corner shop became as crucial to the laudanum epidemic as the physicians who prescribed it. You step back outside, blinking at the rows of identical shops lining the street. It strikes you. Pharmacies really do sit on nearly every corner. In London alone, estimates suggest thousands of outlets sold opium in one form or another. The city itself was awash in tinctures, its economy humming with their trade. Behind every curtain, behind every door, bottles line shelves like household gods. But the scene isn't confined to cities. In rural villages too, laudanum becomes a staple. With few doctors nearby, the local apothecary's shop fills the gap. Farmers buy it for aching joints, mothers for crying infants, servants for restless nights. The drug travels easily, slipping from towns to villages, from villages to cottages. Pause here with me at the corner of a Manchester street. The factory whistles have just blown, and workers pour out tired and coughing. Many stop at the grocer's on their way home, not just for bread or salt pork, but for laudanum. A penny's worth in a bottle slipped into a pocket. At home, they'll swallow it to dull the ache of 14-hour shifts, to silence hunger pangs, to find a sleep unbroken by nightmares of machines. Laudanum isn't just a luxury of parlours, it's a working-class survival strategy. The paradox is striking. For the middle and upper classes, laudanum is about refinement, quieting nerves, smoothing moods, enhancing fragile beauty. For the working poor, it is blunt necessity, a shield against hunger, exhaustion, despair. Two worlds, one bottle, two different stories. But in both cases the result is the same. Bodies hollowed, spirits dulled, ghostliness spreading. You think of the apothecary, bustling cheerfully as he sells another vial. He likely doesn't see himself as a dealer in death. He sees himself as a man of medicine, a provider of relief, a servant of his community. But relief given indiscriminately, endlessly, becomes its own poison. The pharmacy on every corner is both sanctuary and snare. Here's another curious detail. Some apothecaries offered loyalty to specific brands, proudly advertising which manufacturer's laudanum they stocked. Competition was fierce. Advertisements boasted of purity, strength and flavour, as though selling soap or tea. Customers compared notes, debating which cordial tasted smoother, which syrup worked fastest. Imagine discussing your preferred brand of laudanum the way modern people compare coffee blends, and always the same cycle repeated. A spoonful for relief, another for comfort, another because the body demanded it. The bottles emptied quickly, and the apothecary was always there, always ready, on the corner. As the night deepens, you walk further down the street. The lamplight glints on glass windows, row after row of shops promising the same salvation. You realise the ubiquity itself is part of the epidemic. If laudanum were rare or costly, perhaps it would not spread so far. But with pharmacies on every corner, temptation is unavoidable. You can no more escape laudanum than you can escape the fog rolling off the Thames, and so you picture the city as one vast apothecary, its veins running with amber tincture. From palaces to slums, from drawing rooms to factory dormitories, the same bottles circulate. The pharmacies are only the visible nodes in a much larger web, the web of empire, trade, demand and silence. You pause at the end of the street looking back at the rows of glowing windows. Inside, apothecaries keep corking bottles, scribbling labels, stacking shelves. The bell over the door jingles over and over all night long. Customers flow in, relief flows out, and the ghost-making continues without pause. The pharmacies on every corner are more than shops. They are the silent arteries of a society dosing itself into stillness, one teaspoon at a time. And as you step back into the fog, you know that behind every cheerful sale lies another ghostly figure in the making. The fog curls around you as you leave the crowded street of glowing apothecary windows and turn into a narrower lane. Here the noise of carts fades, replaced by the muffled hush of private houses. Curtains are drawn, gas lamps glow faintly in iron brackets, and every doorway feels like a threshold between the public bustle and private silence. You pause before one such home, a respectable townhouse with polished brass knocker and lace curtains. From the outside it promises order and dignity, but as you slip through the door you sense immediately what the outside world cannot see. These homes are thick with secrets. The parlour is warm, carpeted, tidy. A clock ticks, a fire crackles low. A lady sits in her chair with embroidery hoop in hand, but her needle falters. Her husband is away at his club, her children upstairs in bed. She's alone, and her composure frays. Her eyes flick to the sideboard, to the drawer where a familiar bottle lies hidden beneath linens. She sets her needlework aside, draws it out, pours a small measure, and swallows quickly. as though stealing something forbidden. Then she sits very still, waiting for the warmth to spread through her chest, for the soft fog to descend behind her eyes. This is the rhythm of countless homes. By day, women host teas, manage servants, supervise children, maintain their air of perfect respectability. By night, they turn to the secret solace of laudanum. It is never displayed openly, never spoken of aloud. Bottles are hidden in sewing baskets, in dressing table drawers, behind jars of jam in the pantry. To outsiders, the household gleams with virtue. Inside, its women drift in silence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, women made up a disproportionately high number of habitual laudanum users in Britain. Doctors themselves acknowledged it, though often couched in terms of female weakness rather than medical overprescribing. Memoirs and case studies from the era describe women who consumed opium tinctures daily, sometimes for decades, while maintaining outward appearances of propriety. You notice the tremor in her hand as she resumes her embroidery. She tries to hide it even though no one is watching. Respectability, after all, is as much for oneself as for society. The trembling betrays the dependence she cannot name. Her husband may suspect but chooses not to confront her. It is easier for him to pretend her serenity is natural, that her quietness is virtue rather than chemical hush. The household, like many others, colludes in silence. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some women reportedly went so far as to dye their laudanum bottles with harmless food colouring, disguising them as perfume or cordial in case visitors noticed. Others poured their doses into teacups, sipping among friends as though sharing nothing more suspicious than Earl Grey. The performance of normality was constant, intricate, and exhausting. Historians still argue whether Victorian society as a whole was blind to these hidden addictions, or whether everyone knew but agreed not to mention it. Some argue the veil of propriety was so thick that husbands, children and neighbours genuinely did not see the signs. Others suggest the opposite, that they saw perfectly well but colluded in silence because acknowledging it would disrupt the fragile illusion of domestic order. Walk through the house with me. Upstairs the children sleep soundly, their nurse dozing in a chair outside the nursery. She too has a bottle tucked away in her pocket, taken in tiny sips to dull her long hours. Downstairs the cook snores lightly in the kitchen, weary from endless labour. Even she keeps a cordial on a shelf by the stove, purchased cheap from the corner shop. The household, from mistress to servant, hums under the same amber haze, yet no one speaks of it. It is the unspoken common ground, the secret glue of endurance. But secrets leak, eventually. Letters survive from husbands complaining to doctors about wives grown indolent and pale. Diaries whisper of women ashamed of their reliance, praying for strength to give it up. And still the bottles refill. Respectable households become quiet theatres of contradiction, where devotion to propriety masks dependence, where the image of order conceals the reality of erosion. Imagine it, a dinner party in this very home. Guests gather, laughter bright, silver polished to mirror shine. The lady of the house smiles graciously, cheeks faintly flushed with rouge. She seems the perfect hostess. Yet you know that before the guests arrived, she slipped away to her dressing room and took her measure of laudanum. Her smile is steadier for it, her patience longer, her laughter smoother. None of her guests suspect, or if they do, they never say. The secret stays locked behind lace curtains. You pause before a family portrait hanging on the wall. Husband, wife, children pose stiffly in their best clothes. The painter captured dignity, serenity, prosperity. But you can almost see through the paint. The trembling hands, the dulled eyes, the bottles hidden just out of frame. The painting, like the home itself, is a mask. Behind it lies the ghostliness that no respectable family admits. Step back outside with me. Look up and down the row of houses, every one of them outwardly identical. Polished brass, lace curtains, tidy steps. And you know the truth now. Behind each door lies another home thick with secrets. Another woman dosing herself into silence. Another family colluding in quiet denial. The epidemic isn't loud. It doesn't roar like plague or crash like war. It seeps, softly, invisibly, hidden in drawers and teacups. And yet, you feel the weight of it pressing on the street like fog. An entire society living double lives, public virtue and private haze, secrets woven so tightly into the fabric of domestic life that to tug on them would unravel everything. The lady in the parlour has set aside her embroidery now. Her hands rest quietly in her lap, her eyes closed, her face calm. She looks serene, angelic, almost saintly. If her husband walked in now, he would praise her composure, her grace. He would never think to ask what made her so quiet, and she would never tell. The secret sits corked on the sideboard, waiting for tomorrow. Homes thick with secrets, ghosts in every room, and a silence so deep it becomes indistinguishable from respectability itself. The dawn breaks grey and damp over the rows of tidy houses. You step into one of them quietly, and the moment you cross the threshold you feel it. A heaviness, like the air itself is tired. The house is orderly, the breakfast table neatly laid, but its mistress moves slowly, as if her body no longer keeps pace with time. She is thin, too thin, and her cheeks are hollow. Her gown, once perfectly fitted, now hangs a little loose at the shoulders. She smiles faintly as she greets you, but her lips barely curve, as though the effort costs her more than she has to give. This is what laudanum does over the long years. It does not announce itself with drama, but with the steady erosion of life, the slow wasting away. She pours herself tea, hands trembling slightly. The spoon clinks against the china, louder than it should in the quiet room. Then, as casually as you might reach for sugar, she tips a few drops of laudanum into her cup. She drinks, sighs, and settles back. You realise that what you are witnessing is not an occasional indulgence. It is habit, ritual, dependence woven into the very fabric of her day. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Physicians and reformers of the late 19th century began to recognise opium habitués among their patients, particularly women, whose health deteriorated not from acute overdose but from years of steady use. Reports described symptoms strikingly similar across cases: weight loss, pallor, digestive troubles, nervous agitation when deprived, and a general decline into weakness. The pattern became unmistakable, even if society was reluctant to name it addiction. The lady of the house exemplifies every detail. Her appetite is gone. The breakfast she sets before herself, bread, butter, boiled egg, remains untouched. She picks at it politely, then folds her napkin and claims she is not hungry. You can see the bones of her wrists too clearly, the fine blue veins like threads beneath her skin. She's become the very image of delicacy, though not by choice. Her children notice, though they do not say so. They eat their porridge in silence, glancing at their mother with worried eyes. The eldest daughter, scarcely 12, has begun taking over many of her tasks, writing letters, managing the servants, because her mother so often rests in her chair, too weak to rise. But when visitors call, the lady insists all is well. She smiles faintly, claims she suffers from nervous weakness, and everyone nods knowingly. No one presses further. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian women actually embroidered little covers for their laudanum bottles, lace sleeves or fabric pouches that disguised them on dressing tables. The bottles became part of the decor, hidden in plain sight. You imagine the lady's bottle tucked beside her perfumes, dressed in silk, as if the disguise could soften the truth of what it contained. Historians still argue whether women in this state thought of themselves as ill or simply accepted their decline as part of life. Some letters suggest they knew perfectly well they were being drained by the drug, but felt powerless to stop. Others reveal a strange resignation, describing their frailty almost with pride, as though delicacy itself had become identity. Perhaps both are true, a mixture of denial, helplessness, and social expectation. Walk through the house with me. In the drawing room, the air feels stale, as though no laughter has lingered here for months. Dust gathers on music sheets by the piano, the keys go unplayed, the sewing basket lies abandoned, thread tangled. You realise the wasting away is not only physical, it is spiritual too. Energy drains not just from bodies, but from the rhythms of domestic life. A house ruled by laudanum grows quiet, subdued, almost hollow. The servants whisper among themselves. They notice their mistress eats little, that she spends long hours reclining, that her temper frays if the bottle runs dry. But they do not dare speak beyond their circles. Respectability demands silence, and so the household becomes complicit in her decline. Outside, neighbours gossip lightly. She has grown so fragile, one says. Poor thing, her constitution must be weak. They admire her pallor, her delicate hands, her thin frame. They do not speak of opium, even if they suspect it. To name it would be vulgar. Easier to pretend fragility is fashionable, not fatal. But you know better. You've seen this pattern already, in parlour after parlour. Women vanishing slowly, piece by piece, until only a faint echo remains. It is ghost-making in slow motion, and society applauds it as beauty. The lady moves to her chair by the fire, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She closes her eyes, the morning slipping away before it has even begun. Her embroidery lies untouched, her letters unwritten. The day itself seems wasted before noon. This is the laudanum rhythm, bursts of dreamy energy followed by long stretches of torpor. Ambition dissolves, habits erode, life itself shrinks into narrower and narrower circles. Here's another striking detail. By the late 1800s, some doctors began to classify opium habituation as a distinct medical condition. They noted that patients wasted away even when no other illness could explain it. They debated whether to call it moral weakness or disease, and the debate shaped how society treated sufferers. Was the lady here a victim of medical malpractice, or was she, as some claimed, to blame for her own decline? The question, unresolved then, lingers even now. Her husband returns home in the evening. He greets her kindly, but with a shadow of impatience. He sees her frailty, her inactivity, and though he may not name it, he resents it. He does not stop the apothecary deliveries, though. Perhaps he prefers a quiet, compliant wife to one restless and demanding. Perhaps he too finds it easier not to know. The wasting continues, sustained by his silent approval, and the children watch. They grow up in a household where decline is normal, where silence replaces energy, where the mother fades before their eyes. Some will carry the pattern into their own lives, reaching for the same bottle when their turn comes. The ghost-making spreads generationally, weaving itself into family memory like an unspoken inheritance. At night, you wander through the house again. The rooms are dim, the air thick. In her chamber, the lady lies in bed, face pale against the pillow, bottle on the nightstand. She takes another dose, closes her eyes, and sinks into shallow sleep. You notice the way her chest rises faintly, the breath too soft, the body too still. It feels like watching someone rehearsing death, night after night. And you realise this is the most insidious truth of all. Laudanum rarely kills outright. It erodes slowly, carving away vitality inch by inch, until what remains is a shadow. The wasting away is not sudden but gradual, so gradual that it can be mistaken for elegance, for weakness, even for peace. Step back outside. The fog curls around the row of houses and you know each one hides a similar story. Behind lace curtains and tidy brass knockers, women are wasting away in silence, their families colluding, their neighbours whispering. It is a slow epidemic, invisible in the statistics of war and plague, yet devastating in its quiet persistence. The slow wasting away. Not a headline, not a scandal, but a tide that pulls countless women toward ghostliness until they are gone before anyone dares to name what hollowed them out. The fog lifts with the morning sun, though not enough to banish the grey that clings to the city. You step into the street, boots striking wet cobblestones, and see them. Women moving through the day like shades, half present, half absent. Their faces are pale, eyes heavy-lidded, bodies wrapped in shawls though the air is mild. They drift rather than walk. They look at the world but not into it, as if some veil separates them from the bustle around them. This is the ghostliness that no night or secret parlour can fully conceal. It spills out into daylight, onto streets, into markets, into churches. A woman stands at a grocer's stall, a basket on her arm. She inspects the apples, but her gaze is distant, unfocused. The grocer waits, coughs politely, but she takes too long to choose, as though even the act of decision is too heavy. Finally she nods, pays, and drifts away. Another woman guides her child across the street with too much care, as if her body moves through treacle. The child tugs impatiently, but she is slow, too slow, caught in her own haze. You watch them all, and the word ghosts comes unbidden. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, social commentators were noting the prevalence of opium ladies, women who appeared in public visibly frail, sluggish, or distracted, yet still clothed in respectability. Articles in periodicals sometimes described them as if they were a new social type, a recognisable figure of the age. Though couched politely, the implication was clear. Laudanum dependency had become visible, not just whispered about. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, people coined nicknames for them. In Lancashire, they were sometimes called poppy wives. In London, satirists joked of the tinctured. Even the slang carried an odd gentleness, as though mocking without quite daring to condemn. Society was always more comfortable with euphemism than with truth. Historians still argue how many people noticed these ghosts in daylight, and how many simply looked past them. Some claim the signs were obvious. The pallor, the thinness, the absent gaze. Others suggest that Victorian society was so accustomed to illness and frailty in general, consumption, malnutrition, endless ailments, that laudanum's effects blended into the background. The debate lingers, but as you stand here on this street you cannot miss the difference. These women are not simply ill. They are elsewhere, present but not present, their spirits already slipping sideways. Step with me into a church on Sunday morning. The pews are filled, hymnals open, voices rising, but you notice how many faces look slack, how many heads bow, not in reverence but in exhaustion. A woman leans against the pew, eyes closed. Another clasps her prayer book with trembling fingers. The minister preaches fervently, but his congregation is subdued, as if half their souls have wandered elsewhere. Faith and laudanum intermingle strangely here, one promising eternal rest, the other offering a pale imitation in life. After the service, the parishioners file out into the daylight. They look ordinary enough, hats pinned, gloves buttoned. Yet you can feel the difference. They're ghosts in daylight, carrying bottles tucked discreetly in handbags, waiting for the next dose. At the marketplace, the scene repeats. Children run and laugh, vendors shout, the clatter of horse hooves fills the air. But amid the bustle, women drift like shadows, quieter, slower, apart. One woman stands at a fabric stall, her hand lingering too long on the cloth, as if lost in its texture. Another counts coins twice, 3 times, unable to focus. Their friends chatter brightly beside them, covering the silences, smoothing over the odd pauses. Everyone participates in the performance of normality. Yet you know the truth. These women are fading. Their bodies are here, but their vitality is gone, siphoned by the drops of laudanum taken each morning, each night. Walk further with me into a genteel neighbourhood. Here, the women stroll with parasols, skirts sweeping the pavement. They look elegant from a distance, graceful silhouettes in the sun. But up close, you see the same ghostliness. A smile that never quite reaches the eyes, a complexion too pale, lips too thin. Their conversation drifts, polite but vacant, punctuated by long pauses. It is as though they walk in 2 worlds at once, the visible city and some inner fog where only they wander. A carriage passes, and inside you glimpse another woman reclining, her posture slack, gaze unfocused. Even wealth cannot mask the ghostliness. It slips through silk gowns as easily as through plain cotton. Here's a scene to linger on, a mother leading her children through a park. They run ahead, chasing one another, calling to her. She raises her hand to wave, but does not hurry after them. Her step is slow, her smile faint. She looks like a phantom chaperone, tethered more to her inner haze than to the living world around her. The children laugh, oblivious. To them she is simply mother, even if her presence feels thinner each day. And you realise this is the true cruelty of it. Ghostliness in daylight does not mean absence of love or duty. It means presence without vitality, affection dulled, energy gone. These women continue their roles, shopping, mothering, hosting, but they do so half-faded, shadows of themselves. By afternoon, the sun slants through the smog, casting everything in golden grey light. You see them everywhere, on doorsteps, in carriages, in shop queues. Ghosts in daylight, invisible because they are so common. You wonder if the city itself notices, or if it accepts this half-life as normal. Perhaps both. Perhaps an entire society is fading, 1 teaspoon at a time, and calling it refinement. Here's the chilling part. This ghostliness doesn't hide indoors anymore. It spills into the streets, into the very image of Victorian society. Portrait painters capture it. Fashion writers describe it. Novelists hint at it. It becomes not just private tragedy, but public aesthetic. The city itself begins to look pale, dreamy, subdued, as though the laudanum haze has escaped its bottles and settled over everything. And as you walk away, you can't shake the sight of them. Women drifting like shades in the daylight, half alive, half absent. They are everywhere, and yet nowhere, seen but unseen. The city is full of ghosts, though the cemeteries are no more crowded than before. Ghosts in daylight, born not from death, but from the slow dissolving of life itself. The fog lingers in the alleys as you drift toward the sound of children's voices. At first, it is laughter, thin, high, bright. But as you step closer, you notice something unsettling. The children tire too quickly. Their play fades into quiet sitting, heads nodding, shoulders slumping. You realise with a cold jolt that the ghostliness you've traced in parlours and marketplaces has not stopped with the mothers. It seeps into the next generation. The children inherit the haze. A little boy sits on the step outside a cottage, his cheeks far too hollow for his age. He sways gently as though drowsy, though the morning sun is barely up. Inside the cottage, his mother has been dosing him with Godfrey's cordial since infancy. At first it was to hush colic, then to help him sleep through long nights while she worked at the mill. Now he is 6, and though still alive, he looks faded already. His energy is gone, his limbs frail, his eyes dulled. He is a ghost in miniature, wandering daylight before his life has truly begun. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Victorian Britain, child mortality rates were among the highest in Europe, and investigators increasingly linked this to the widespread use of opium syrups for infants and children. Reports from factory towns in the 1860s and 1870s described entire communities where babies were given daily doses so their mothers could work long hours. Some died outright, others survived but grew weak and stunted. The drug shaped not just one generation of mothers, but their children as well. And here's a quirky tidbit. Advertisements for children's cordials sometimes boasted of their ability to quiet the babe for hours, which weary mothers saw as a blessing. One pamphlet even promised that a properly dosed infant would sleep so soundly, you may leave them unattended and trust they will not cry. The irony is brutal. What was marketed as safety was in truth a dangerous stillness. Historians still argue whether parents knew the long-term harm they were causing, or whether they were simply deceived by marketing and necessity. Some letters suggest mothers noticed their children grew frail and listless, but with no alternatives, they continued dosing. Others point to cases where parents explicitly denied knowing anything was wrong, insisting their quiet children were healthy. The debate reflects the murky moral fog of the age. Walk with me into a crowded tenement. The air is thick with coal smoke, the floors damp, the walls thin as paper. In one room, 5 children share a bed. Their mother, worn to the bone from endless laundry work, pours cordial into a spoon and feeds each child before sleep. The younger ones drift quickly into silence, their breathing shallow. The older ones swallow dutifully, accustomed to the nightly ritual. For them, laudanum is not medicine, not indulgence. It is simply life, woven into childhood like lullabies or bedtime prayers. The next morning they rise slowly, dull-eyed, limbs heavy. At school they cannot focus, their letters blurred, their sums forgotten. The teacher scolds them for laziness, never knowing their minds swim in fog. The children inherit not just their parents' poverty, but their chemical ghosts. But it isn't only the poor. In more respectable homes, children also sip from bottles disguised as soothing syrups. A governess slips a spoonful to a restless toddler so she may complete her lessons in peace. A nurse hushes an infant with a cordial so she may tend to the household chores. Even wealthy parents, desperate for quiet evenings, sanction the practice. The difference is only in the labels and the quality of glass. Amber vials for the rich, crude jars for the poor. The result is the same. Imagine the nursery of a grand townhouse. Toys scattered across the floor, a rocking horse gleaming in the corner, lace curtains drawn. In the crib, a baby sleeps unnaturally still. The nurse hums softly, rocking gently in her chair. On the table nearby, a small bottle sits half empty, its label boasting of guaranteed rest. The parents downstairs dine by candlelight, remarking proudly on their child's angelic temperament. They do not know, or do not wish to know, the cost of such angelic quiet. The haze stretches into adolescence. Some children who grow up dosed regularly continue the habit themselves. By the time they are teenagers, their bodies crave the familiar syrup. They slip coins to apothecaries, buying bottles for mother, but keeping them for their own use. What began as survival in infancy becomes dependence in youth. A cycle begins to repeat. Ghostliness inherited, then perpetuated. And here's another unsettling glimpse. Reformers writing in the late 19th century described entire villages in the north of England where children appeared stunted and pale, their growth slowed by constant opium consumption. They were, in effect, ghostly before adulthood. A generation raised in fog. Step into a schoolyard. The bell rings, children pour out, shouting and laughing, but some stand apart. They do not run, they shuffle. They do not laugh, they watch, thin and silent. Their classmates call them sleepy or strange. Teachers mark them as inattentive. No one names the true culprit. The haze is invisible, passed down like a family heirloom no one admits owning. You feel the weight of it pressing harder now. It is one thing for mothers to slip into ghostliness, but to see it etched onto children is another. The epidemic no longer hides in parlours. It shapes the very future, hollowing it before it arrives. Historians still argue whether the widespread child dosing was born primarily of poverty or of cultural acceptance. Was it necessity? Mothers with no other way to keep their children quiet while they worked? Or was it fashion, the belief that a quiet child was a well-raised one? Likely it was both. Either way, the result was the same. Children inheriting not only their mother's bottles, but their mother's ghostliness. As evening falls, you pass through a street where children play faintly in the fading light. Their laughter is thin, their steps slower than they should be. They look like echoes of what childhood ought to be, half present, half absent, drifting like little phantoms through the smoke. Their mothers call them inside, some lovingly, some impatiently. Doors close, shutters draw. Behind each one, another spoonful waits, and you realise with a chill, the ghosts of Victorian laudanum are not confined to women alone. They are already shaping the next generation, weaving fragility into the very bones of children. The haze has been inherited. The ghost-making continues. The evening fog rolls heavier now, but cutting through it you hear voices raised. Not the soft whispers of parlours, nor the nervous gossip of neighbours, but sharp, urgent tones that carry the force of conviction. You follow the sound down a narrow street into a meeting hall lit by oil lamps. Wooden benches line the room, pamphlets scatter the floor, and at the front stands a man with a pamphlet in one hand and his fist in the other. He is not whispering, he is shouting. For the first time in this story, you hear voices crying out against the amber ghost. The reformers have arrived. They are preachers, temperance activists, physicians weary of denial, and women who've buried too many children in tiny graves. They speak of the poppy curse, of silent poison, of our women fading into shadows. Their words are fiery, their tone urgent. The room hums with unease, because everyone present knows the truth already. But to hear it spoken aloud feels like tearing lace curtains off a window and letting the whole street look in. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s and 1880s, temperance societies and public health reformers began campaigning openly against the unregulated sale of opium. Reports like the 1868 Pharmacy Act debates highlighted growing concern. Clergymen thundered from pulpits, pamphlets warned of the laudanum evil, and local reform committees began petitioning Parliament for stricter controls. You glance at the audience. Many are women in plain bonnets, their hands raw from labour, their eyes fierce. They know the cost of opium not as theory, but as lived experience. One has lost 2 infants to soothing syrups. Another tends to a sister who wastes away daily from her bottles. They murmur "Amen" as the speaker condemns the apothecaries for selling poison like sweetmeats. The anger in their voices is quieter than his, but deeper, sharper, truer. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some reform pamphlets were illustrated with dramatic woodcuts, skulls hidden inside cordial bottles, skeletal mothers rocking ghostly babies. They were lurid and a bit theatrical, but they sold widely. Children even cut them out and pasted them into scrapbooks, grim paper dolls of reform. Historians still argue whether these reformers were motivated more by genuine compassion or by the Victorian appetite for moral crusade. Some see them as early public health advocates, bravely naming the dangers of addiction. Others argue they were more concerned with policing women's behaviour, folding the opium campaign into broader battles against alcohol and female intemperance. The truth, as always, is tangled. Compassion and control often walked hand in hand. The preacher at the front pounds his fist on the lectern. We have allowed poison into our homes, into our nurseries, into our very bloodlines. And why? Because it is profitable, because it is easy. His voice rises to a tremor. I tell you, it must end. Applause ripples through the hall. Pamphlets are passed hand to hand, their titles blunt. The curse of laudanum, infant poisoning in our midst, the fading of England's mothers. You feel the heat of outrage in the air. But you also sense the resistance outside these walls. Apothecaries, physicians, even many families are not ready to give up their little helpers. Reformers shout, but the whispers of comfort still drown them out in parlours and kitchens. Step outside with me for a moment. On a street corner nearby, a man hands out tracts. A passerby takes one, frowns, crumples it, and tosses it aside. Another laughs outright. Nonsense. My wife has taken drops for 20 years, and she is fine. The reformer tries again, handing out another tract. For every pamphlet accepted, 2 are discarded. For every sermon preached, 12 bottles are sold. The cry is loud, but the resistance is louder still. Still, seeds are planted. In Parliament, debates grow heated. Politicians quote statistics of infant deaths in factory towns, of women wasting in middle-class homes. The newspapers print letters to the editor, some demanding stricter laws, others defending laudanum as a necessary household medicine. The battle lines form not in battlefields, but in columns and pamphlets, in halls like this one. The reformers gain allies among doctors too. A new generation trained in emerging sciences begins to question the indiscriminate prescribing of opium. They warn of dependency, of long-term decline. Their voices join the chorus, though not without opposition from older physicians who cling to their amber miracle. Imagine the tension in a Victorian household where these pamphlets arrive. A wife folds hers quickly, hiding it in her sewing basket. A husband reads one aloud with scorn, declaring it sensationalist drivel. The children glance nervously at their mother, who sips her tea just a little too quietly. The pamphlet ends up in the fire. The debate lives not only in public halls but in private silences, in homes where secrets are thick and whispers dangerous. Here's another striking scene. A funeral in a factory town. The coffin is heartbreakingly small. The minister speaks of God's will, but the mothers gathered around know better. They murmur about soothing syrup, about too much cordial, about a baby too quiet for too long. Their grief turns into anger, and soon they too are writing letters, signing petitions, crying out for change. Reform is born as much from graves as from pulpits. Historians still argue whether reform truly saved lives in the short term. Some point to the Pharmacy Act of 1868, which restricted the sale of poisons, including opium, to registered chemists. It was a step forward, but laudanum remained legal, cheap, and available. Others argue the cultural shift mattered more than the law, the slow process of making laudanum shameful rather than respectable. Either way, reformers had cracked the silence. Return with me to the meeting hall. The speaker's voice is hoarse now, but he presses on. We cannot raise a nation of ghosts. We must choose life. Applause erupts, stamping feet echoing against wooden floors. For a moment you believe the tide might turn here, that the cry will swell until it drowns out the apothecary's bells. But when the meeting ends, the crowd files out into the same fog, toward the same streets, toward homes where bottles still wait. Reformers cry out, yes, but the ghost-making has deep roots, and the fog does not lift easily. Still, you cannot forget the sound of their voices, hoarse, urgent, unafraid. In a world thick with secrets and whispers, it is the first clear cry. The ghosts have been named, the silence has been broken. The meeting hall's echoes of angry voices fade into the fog as you walk back into the city, but something lingers in the air now. Change. Not rapid, not thunderous, but slow and deliberate, the way Parliament always moves. For decades, laudanum bottles have sat quietly on mantels and shop shelves, disguised as medicine and embraced as comfort. Now, at last, the law begins to stir, grudgingly, cautiously, as though afraid to rattle the bottles too loudly. You step into the gallery of the House of Commons. The benches are crowded, the air heavy with cigar smoke and the scratch of pens. Papers rustle, voices rise and fall. You hear words like regulation, public health, pharmacy, poisons. For the first time in this long story, lawmakers are trying to pull opium out of the shadows of domestic life and drag it into the light of statute. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1868, Britain passed the first Pharmacy Act that specifically regulated the sale of poisons, including opium. From then on, only registered chemists could sell it, and sales had to be recorded. It was not a ban, far from it. Laudanum remained widely available, but it was a turning point. The state acknowledged that the drug was not harmless, and that it needed some kind of boundary. The debate, however, is thick with contradiction. One member insists opium is a vital medicine, too essential to restrict. Another counters with reports of infant deaths in factory towns. One praises laudanum as the poor man's doctor, affordable relief for every ailment. Another demands to know how many quiet babies are lying cold in churchyards because of it. The chamber swells with voices, half defending commerce and convenience, half crying out for protection. Historians still argue about the motivations behind these reforms. Some believe they were driven primarily by public health concerns, rising awareness of infant mortality, wasted mothers, addicted writers. Others insist economics played just as strong a role. Restricting who could sell opium gave licensed pharmacists more power, pushing small grocers and village shops out of the trade. Whether compassion or commerce prevailed is still debated. You leave the chamber and walk through London's streets, noticing the small signs of law at work. In some shops, laudanum bottles now sit behind counters instead of openly on display. In others, customers are asked to sign their names in ledgers. It feels theatrical, more ritual than barrier, but it is something. Mothers still buy soothing syrups, women still slip bottles into handbags, poets still chase visions, but the act carries a faint whiff of shame now, a suggestion that the law disapproves, however gently. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some chemists tried to soften the blow by selling tonics with reduced opium content, advertising them as safer for family use. They gave them fancy names, bottled them in pretty glass, and assured customers they would soothe without harm. In truth, most still contained enough opium to create dependency, but the marketing let families feel virtuous while continuing their habits. It was regulation by half measure, and everyone knew it. Step into a small-town apothecary after 1868. The chemist now keeps a ledger, writing down each purchaser's name. A mother stands nervously as he records her order of Godfrey's cordial. She feels exposed, as if the law itself now peers into her nursery. But she still takes the bottle, tucks it under her shawl, and hurries home. The law stirs, but the habit persists. In another house, a lady of refinement hesitates before asking her physician for another prescription. He gives it readily, but she notices his tone is slightly changed, more cautious, almost apologetic. She blushes faintly. For the first time, she feels that what was once respectable has become questionable. The law's stirrings seep into conscience, into reputation, into the small hesitations of everyday life. But resistance is everywhere. Apothecaries complain the law interferes with trade. Doctors protest that their hands are being tied. Families grumble that the state is meddling in private life. And in the poorest neighbourhoods, where opium is still cheaper than food or drink, the new rules barely reach. The fog of laudanum continues to roll through alleys and parlours alike, slipping past the law's fragile barriers. Here's another curious moment. In 1878, further restrictions are debated with proposals to limit how much opium could be sold at one time. The arguments turn almost comical. One member insists that too strict a law would prevent honest mothers from soothing their infants. Another claims the English constitution is too sturdy to be harmed by a cordial. The laughter in the chamber is loud, but beneath it runs fear. Fear of losing what has become daily necessity. The law stirs, but society clings to its bottles, and yet, slowly, things shift. By the 1890s, opium begins to lose its aura of respectability. Medical journals grow louder in their warnings. Reformed societies publish more pamphlets. Newspapers print stories of women wasting away, of children stunted, of writers ruined. The word habit becomes whispered with disapproval. Pharmacies, once glowing with open displays, now tuck their bottles further out of sight. You realise what you're witnessing is not a revolution, but a long erosion. The law does not strike like lightning, it seeps like rain. Gradually the bottles lose their innocence. Gradually the women who sip from them lose the halo of delicacy and gain the shadow of weakness. Gradually society begins to see what it had pretended not to see for so long. But the ghosts remain. The lady in her parlour still pours drops into her tea, even if she feels faintly ashamed now. The mother in the mill town still doses her baby, ledger or no ledger. The poet in his study still chases visions, though he knows the world now calls him addict rather than muse. The law stirs, yes, but it does not yet banish the haze. You step out of the chamber into the foggy night. The lamps glow dimly, the streets are quiet. Somewhere a chemist's bell jingles as another bottle changes hands. Somewhere a child drifts into unnatural silence. Somewhere a woman sighs with relief as the warmth spreads through her chest. The law has stirred, but the ghosts still walk in daylight. And you know it will take more than ledgers and pamphlets to drive them away. The year tilts forward, and with it you feel the weight of time shifting. You leave behind the gaslit streets of late Victorian London, but the ghosts you've been walking among do not vanish. They follow, drifting across the threshold of centuries, their bottles in hand, their frailty woven into the culture itself. The world changes. The telegraph hums, trains thunder, factories roar louder, but the soft clink of a laudanum vial persists. It becomes clear. The drug is not a relic of one age. It is a thread carried forward, stitching itself into the fabric of the 20th century in new, sometimes harsher, sometimes subtler forms. Imagine the dawn of the new century. The Victorians fade, but their heirs inherit both their progress and their shadows. Doctors are more sceptical now, chemists keep stricter ledgers, and yet, in countless homes, women continue dosing themselves. The language shifts, tonics, elixirs, nervous cures, but the essence remains. The ghost-making tincture has simply changed its costume. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Morphine, isolated from opium in the early 19th century, grew in popularity by the late Victorian and early Edwardian years. By the turn of the century, hypodermic needles were increasingly used by doctors to administer morphine, especially for pain. Soon, morphine addiction rivaled laudanum dependency, and the cycle of relief and ruin deepened. The bottle in the parlour gave way to the syringe in the doctor's bag, but the story was the same. Picture an Edwardian lady in a lace-trimmed gown. She no longer pours laudanum into tea, but receives injections of morphine for her neuralgia. The doctor assures her it is modern, scientific, more precise than her mother's old drops. She believes him. She does not notice that her hands tremble, that her appetite fades, that her days slip into the same fog. The ghost has only changed form, trading amber glass for gleaming steel. And here's a quirky tidbit. By the early 20th century, some patent medicines actually bragged of containing morphine or even heroin, advertising their scientific strength. One infamous brand of cough syrup openly included heroin, marketed as safer than morphine. Parents gave it to children without hesitation. It was progress, they thought. You can almost hear the ghost laughing bitterly. Historians still argue whether the transition from laudanum to morphine and heroin represented genuine medical advancement, or simply another chapter in the same tragedy. Some emphasise the new precision of dosing, the real relief it gave in surgeries and injuries. Others argue that all it did was repackage dependency under a shinier label. Either way, the echoes of the Victorian epidemic rolled forward, whispering through syringes and syrups. Step with me into the trenches of the First World War. The air stinks of mud, cordite, blood. Soldiers cry out and doctors scramble with morphine syrettes, little tubes of salvation stabbed quickly into muscle. Pain fades, but dependency blooms. An entire generation of men comes home haunted not only by shells and nightmares, but by the memory of a morphine's sweet fog. The drug that turned Victorian women into ghosts now trails soldiers too, blurring their days in peacetime. Back home, families are no strangers to these substances. Women sip soothing tonics, men seek morphine from chemists for war injuries, children cough through winters dosed with heroin-laden syrups. The names change, but the echoes remain. By the 1920s, reform has tightened. Laws grow stricter, the sale of opiates more controlled. The tide of patent medicines begins to recede, yet the ghosts refuse to vanish. Doctors still prescribe freely for pain and nerves. Pharmacies still fill bottles, though under heavier locks. And in the shadows, a new market emerges. What was once respectable now becomes illicit. Laudanum no longer sits openly on the sideboard. It passes hand to hand, whispered about, hidden again. You realise the story has flipped. In the Victorian parlour, laudanum was a mark of propriety, even refinement. By the 20th century, opiates begin to carry stigma, shame, criminality. But the women fading in bedrooms, the men wasting in alleyways, the children growing up stunted, they are the same ghosts in different clothes. Walk into a 1930s doctor's office. The decor is modern, the stethoscope sleek. Yet the prescription pad still scrawls familiar words. Morphine, codeine, tinctures. A nervous housewife explains her sleeplessness, her frayed nerves. The doctor nods, writes quickly, reassures her. The same pattern continues. The only difference is that now, whispers of shame surround it. She hides the prescription more carefully, tucks the bottle deeper in the drawer, tells fewer people. The silence thickens, even as the dependency deepens. Here's another glimpse of the echoes. During the Second World War, opiates again follow armies, filling medical kits, dulling wounds, numbing nightmares. And when soldiers return, some carry the haze with them, unable to let go. At home, their wives and mothers dose themselves with sleeping pills, barbiturates by now, but carrying the same ghostly promise of quiet. The tortures passed from laudanum to morphine to heroin to barbiturates, but the cycle is familiar, comfort promised, vitality drained, silence purchased at terrible cost. And here's another quirky tidbit. In the 1950s, cough syrups in some countries still contained morphine derivatives, sold freely over counters. Children lined up for spoonfuls of soothing syrup, much like their Victorian counterparts. Progress, apparently, is a slow and ironic beast. Historians still argue how directly the Victorian laudanum epidemic connects to modern opioid crises. Some see it as a continuous line, one long story of dependency reshaped by chemistry and commerce. Others argue each era has its own unique dynamics, its own cultural meanings for these drugs. But walking through these decades as you are, you can feel the echo too clearly. The ghostly women of Victorian parlours are not gone. They are present in the trembling hands of morphine patients, in the vacant gazes of barbiturate-dulled housewives, in the foggy coughs of children sipping medicated syrups. The shapes differ, but the essence lingers. By the 1960s and 1970s, heroin has left the doctor's bag and entered the street. The amber bottle of laudanum, once elegant on a sideboard, has mutated into a needle in an alley. The respectability is gone, but the destruction is sharper. And yet, listen closely, the language of ghostliness remains. Journalists describe addicts as living shadows, walking dead, ghosts haunting the city. The Victorian imagery has endured, updated for a harsher century. Step back now, pause, and look at the whole arc. From the gentle dropper in a lady's tea, to the cordial in a baby's mouth, to the morphine syringe in a soldier's arm, to the heroin needle in a back street, the thread is unbroken. The drug that turned Victorian women into ghosts did not die with them. It echoed forward, reshaped, renamed, redistributed, but always carrying the same paradox. Comfort that hollows, relief that erases, life bought at the cost of living. You return to the street at dusk. Neon signs flicker now. Motorcars rattle past. Factories belch smoke higher than before. The world is unmistakably modern, yet as you pass a chemist's shop window, you catch sight of familiar glass bottles. Their labels are different, the names changed, the claims more scientific. But you know them for what they are. Echoes, continuations, ghost makers, still at work. The 20th century hums with new inventions, new powers, new wars. But beneath it all, the same quiet sigh repeats in bedrooms and hospitals. The same ghosts drift through daylight. The same cycle of relief and ruin carries forward. The echoes have not faded. They only grow louder. The street has changed again. The lamplight is electric now, humming faintly above your head, but the air is still thick with that familiar fog. Not the kind that rolls off the Thames, but the kind that lingers in lungs and memories. You've followed this story from the drawing rooms of Victorians to the trenches of soldiers, to chemists' counters in the 20th century. And yet, the most haunting part is not how loudly the drug has sometimes spoken, but how quietly it fades. The drug that once sat openly on mantels and sideboards has slipped deeper into shadows. The ghosts it created do not vanish in a blaze, they fade into whispers. Picture a woman in the 1920s no longer wearing a bonnet but a cloche hat. Her laudanum bottle has been replaced with barbiturate pills, prescribed for her nerves. She keeps them in a silver case in her purse, discreet, fashionable. She does not faint dramatically at parties anymore. She merely excuses herself, slips into a powder room, swallows 2 tablets with water, and returns composed. The performance has changed, but the silence remains. Ghostliness now wears rouge and jazz-age pearls. By the 1950s, another woman leans into her kitchen cupboard, reaches past canned soup, and finds a brown bottle of cough syrup laced with codeine. Her child coughs through the night, but the syrup hushes him. She takes a spoonful herself when sleep will not come. The cycle continues, though softer, less visible. The old amber glow of laudanum is now hidden in prescription labels and tidy pillboxes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-20th century, laudanum itself had largely disappeared from everyday households, replaced by standardized opiates and synthetic sedatives. But it never vanished entirely. Even into the 1970s, tincture of opium remained in medical use for certain conditions, such as severe diarrhea. In some hospitals and pharmacies, you could still find it, a faint echo of the Victorian bottle, still clinking softly in drawers. And here's a quirky tidbit. In rural parts of Britain and Ireland, some elderly people continued to ask chemists for the drops, well into the late 20th century, using the same term their grandparents had whispered a century before. For them, laudanum was not history, it was habit, familiar as tea or bread, though diminished and secret. Historians still argue about how we should remember laudanum. Was it a cruel poison that stole vitality from a generation of women, or was it simply the imperfect tool of an imperfect medical age? Some scholars argue it empowered women with relief in a society that gave them so few options. Others insist it enslaved them, reinforcing a culture that prized their fragility. The truth, as always, is tangled in the fog. But as you stand here, listening to the hum of electric signs and the fading hoofbeats of a world long past, you realise the more haunting truth. The ghosts never left. They simply became quieter, less visible, harder to name. The Victorian lady with her trembling hand became the Edwardian invalid with her syringe, the 1930s housewife with her pills, the 1950s child coughing syrup, the 1970s pensioner asking discreetly for the drops. Each generation inherited not just the medicine but the silence around it. You walk into a modern pharmacy. Fluorescent lights glare overhead. Shelves gleam with antiseptic order. Labels are precise. Warnings are printed in bold. Regulations are strict. And yet, look closer. Codeine, morphine, fentanyl. Different names. Stricter packaging. But the lineage is unbroken. The ghosts still walk among us, though now their whispers echo in clinics, in waiting rooms, in the quiet sigh of a patient taking yet another pill for pain. You pause. Think of all the women you followed, fainting in parlours, dosing babies in cottages, drifting in marketplaces, hiding bottles in embroidery baskets. Their voices are mostly gone now, their lives absorbed into statistics, their secrets buried with them. But their presence lingers. In the cultural imagination, they remain. The pale, delicate figures of an age, remembered as much for their fragility as for their resilience. They haunt not because they raged, but because they faded so quietly. And here's the final irony. Victorian society adored whispers. It prized discretion, modesty, quiet suffering. Laudanum fit perfectly into that culture. Its ghosts did not scream. They sighed. They did not revolt. They fainted. They did not march. They drifted. And so the epidemic never exploded with noise. It melted into background, leaving echoes so soft you almost have to strain to hear them. You step into the twilight, and the city around you blurs. Horse hooves and carriages have been replaced by engines, but the pattern is the same. People moving quickly, some fading quietly, bottles, now plastic, now sterile, still passing hand to hand. The fog thins, but the whispers do not. The drug that turned Victorian women into ghosts is not gone. It has simply changed costumes, changed labels, changed contexts. But listen closely, and you can still hear them. The sighs, the silences, the faint laughter before a collapse. Ghosts in parlours, in nurseries, in hospitals, in alleyways. And so, as the final lamps dim and the whispers fade, you understand This story never truly ends. The drug remains. The ghosts remain. The echoes of their quiet suffering follow you still. And now, Night Owl, we come gently to the close. You've walked through drawing rooms and nurseries, pharmacies and parliaments, across centuries of sighs and silences. You've seen women drift into ghostliness, children inherit the haze, reformers cry out, laws stir, and echoes carry forward into the modern age. The story has been long and heavy and haunting, but here, at the end, let the weight lift. Let the ghosts settle. Imagine them no longer fading in pain, but finally at rest. Lace curtains fluttering in a soft breeze, bottles empty and set aside, voices no longer trembling but still. Picture the parlour quiet not because of a tincture's hush, but because the house has finally fallen into true healthy sleep. The city itself grows softer now. The fog clears a little, stars glint faintly above the rooftops. Even the restless streets seem to sigh in relief. The whispers you've been hearing grow fainter, until they are no longer frightening, only gentle, like distant lullabies. Take a breath with them. Slow, steady, quiet. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts untangle. The ghosts you've walked beside are not here to trouble you now. They are history, fading like mist, leaving you only with their lesson, that comfort should never cost a life, that silence should never replace vitality. And so, let go of the streets, the parlours, the bottles. Let them dissolve into dream. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and drift into the safe kind of sleep, the kind unbought by tinctures, the kind your own body makes when it is ready.